Hey guys, tonight we're going to unroll the long tangled scroll of human history like someone tossing open an attic trunk full of yellowed maps, cracked pottery, and oddly judgmental stone statues. Imagine the firelight flickering across the first storytellers' faces as they tried to make sense of the sky above the beasts beyond the tree line and the strange two-legged neighbors in the next valley who might be friends or might be dinner. Before we get going, do me a favor like this video. If you want more long, sleepy wanderings through history, subscribe to join our late-night caravan and tell me in the comments where in the world and what time of night you're listening from. So, close your eyes, lean back, and picture the Earth around 20,000 years ago. The Ice Age still lingers its frozen fingertips, gripping much of the northern hemisphere. Herds of mammoths trudge across steppe-like plains. People live in small bands, moving with the seasons, carrying everything they own on their backs. A human life, then, was shaped by rivers, wines, and migrations by the simple fact that if you didn't keep moving, the food would. And the neighbors with the sharp spears might move in. Yet even in this world of constant motion, seeds, literal and metaphorical, were about to take root. The climate was slowly warming. Glaciers melted back. Grasslands and forests spread. Animals like aurochs and wild goats began to linger near human camps, lured by scraps or protection from predators. Wild grains like einkorn wheat and barley thickened in the fertile crescent, that arc of valleys and rivers stretching from the Levant to Mesopotamia. People started to notice that if you dropped a few seeds near the campsite, green shoots popped up later in the same spot. It probably wasn't a thunderclap revelation, more like a slow dawn. What if instead of chasing dinner, we encouraged dinner to grow closer to home? What if those shaggy, cantankerous goats hanging around the campfire could be, well, slightly less wild? Farming and herding weren't invented in a single village by a single genius. They emerged in scattered experiments across the world, from the highlands of New Guinea with its taro and yams, to Mesoamerica's squash and teosinte ancestor of maize, to China's Yellow and Yangtze River valleys, nurturing millet and rice. Humanity, it seemed, was collectively messily stumbling toward a lifestyle upgrade. But don't picture an overnight leap from loincloths to plowed fields. For centuries, maybe millennia, people mixed old and new hunting, when they could planting, when they had to herding, when the animals cooperated, foraging always. Permanent villages appeared slowly. Jericho, one of the earliest known, rose near an oasis in the Levant, with stone walls and a tower that has stared at desert winds since around 8000 BCE. Catalhoyuk in Anatolia came later, a honeycomb of mud brick homes whose residents painted leaping bulls on their walls and buried ancestors beneath their floors. Why settle at all? Because farming, for all its backbreaking labor, offered calories in bulk. Grain could be stored. Goats and sheep provided milk, meat hides. Surpluses supported more children, more grandparents, maybe even a few specialists who didn't farm full-time, people who napped flint better, wove tighter baskets, or watched the stars and claimed to know what it all meant. With villages came pottery to store grain, weaving to clothe growing families, and eventually the first hints of hierarchy. Some households owned more fields, more animals, more prestige. Yet for early farmers, life wasn't necessarily easier than for their roaming ancestors. Archaeologists comparing skeletons found that early agriculturalists were shorter with more tooth decay and joint problems. A hunter-gatherer diet was diverse. A farmer's diet leaned heavily on whatever staple crop dominated the region. And living cheek by jowl with people and animals meant disease spread like gossip at a village well. Still, farming populations multiplied while foragers thinned out or merged in. Numbers over time win arguments. As centuries passed, the patchwork of fields widened. In Mesopotamia's alluvial plains, irrigation canals shimmered under the sun. In the Nile Valley, predictable floods left black silt for wheat and flax. Along the Indus village networks knitted together across hundreds of miles. In China, rice paddies carved green steps into hillsides. Agriculture was turning landscapes into human artifacts. Rivers channeled forests, cleared hills, terraced, shaping the very ecology on which future cities would rise. And with food, surpluses came something new: leisure, or at least the possibility of it. A farmer might still toil from dawn to dusk, but somewhere in the village, someone had the time to carve beads, experiment with pigments, or wonder why the moon waxed and waned. Religious rituals grew elaborate stone circles, ancestor cults, fertility figurines. Maybe if you pleased the right sky god, the harvest would thrive. Maybe the dead could help the living if honored properly. Ideas spread with trade goods, obsidian for blades, seashells for ornaments, stories for evenings by the hearth. By around 5000 BCE, much of the Old World was a quilt of villages, fields, and grazing lands stitched together by footpaths and river routes. No kings, yet no pyramids or ziggurats, but the blueprint of civilization was sketched in grain stalks and goat tracks. Humans were no longer merely surviving in nature. They were beginning, however crudely, to organize it. It's tempting to see this as progress with a capital P, the first rung on some inevitable ladder toward Wi-Fi and indoor plumbing. But history is messier. Farming locked people to territories worth defending, sparked disputes over water and land, and encouraged social hierarchies. It created wealth and jealousy, ambition, theft. Yet it also birthed art myth, and the first faint sense that humans might shape destiny rather than drift through it. So picture the twilight over one of those first villages, smoke rising from hearths, goats bleeding in pens, children chasing each other between mud brick homes. Beyond the fields lies wilderness. Beyond the horizon, other bands still wander with spears and baskets. But here for tonight, at least the future sleeps under thatched roofs. Soon there will be temples, markets' walls, and kings. But before all that, there was this, a quiet evening, when the long experiment of civilization had just begun to murmur to life. Close your eyes and picture the hush just before dawn over a river plain. The reeds stir, frogs croak, and in the distance smoke drifts from hearths where people are already awake grinding grain or stoking fires. This is no small village now, no scatter of mud huts. This is something larger, more complex a city, and one of humanity's boldest experiments. The first true cities didn't rise randomly on mountaintops or lonely plains. They grew like reeds in the fertile mud of river valleys. The Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile in Egypt, the Indus in South Asia, the Yellow River in China, all became cradles of civilizations, though none of them were particularly comfortable cribs. These rivers flooded, shifted, and sometimes drowned fields and towns. But they also offered what people craved: water for crops, routes for trade, and soil rich enough to feed thousands. Take Uruk around 4000 BCE. If you could stroll through its streets, though you might need sandals thick enough to handle the hot dust, you'd pass mud brick walls looming over the plain canals, threading through neighborhoods and temples rising like stairways to the gods. Crowds bustled through markets, donkeys brayed under loads, and scribes pressed reed styluses into wet clay. Uruk wasn't just a bigger village. It was something categorically different. Here, specialization multiplied. Not everyone had to grow food anymore. Some wove cloth, some baked bread, some kept accounts. Complexity fed on itself. Writing one of history's slyest revolutions emerged from this urban hum. Cuneiform began as simple tally marks: this many jars of oil, that many sheep. But once you start recording quantities, you soon want to note names, places prayers. By 2500 BCE, those clay tablets bore myths, contracts, and royal boasts. It's a pattern we'll see again. Inventions that begin as humble tools of survival end up carrying poetry and prophecy. Meanwhile, to the west, the Nile unrolled its gift like a yearly clockwork. Every summer, floodwaters spilled dark silt across the floodplain, leaving behind fields fat with fertility. Egyptian farmers planted wheat and flax, tended by irrigation ditches, simple but effective. Out of that dependable rhythm came confidence and monuments. The pyramids at Giza, built in the 3rd millennium BCE, weren't just oversized tombs. They were stone proclamations that kings could command tens of thousands, organize resources for decades, and aim at eternity itself. Imagine the clatter of copper chisels against limestone, the chanting of work crews, the steady grind of sledges over sand. These weren't slaves in chains, as old Hollywood liked to suggest, but mostly farmers conscripted during the agricultural off-season, paid in bread and beer. Labor, in other words, became another kind of tax. Further east, the Indus Valley nurtured its own marvels. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro weren't dominated by pyramids or palaces, but by an astonishing sense of order. Streets ran in grids, lined with brick houses, boasting private baths and drains. Wells punctuated neighborhoods, and a great public bath, perhaps a ritual center, sat at the city's core. The uniformity of bricks across sites suggests some kind of standardization, even bureaucracy. Yet no giant statues of kings loom over us here, and their script scratched into seals of animals and symbols remains undeciphered. Who ruled these cities? Councils, priests, merchants. The silence of undeciphered symbols leaves us guessing. Sometimes history taunts us with mysteries more stubborn than stone. In China's Yellow River Valley, meanwhile, Shang rulers presided over walled cities by the 2nd millennium BCE. Their diviners heated turtle shells and ox bones until they cracked, then read the fissures like cosmic handwriting. Those oracle bones recorded questions about crops wars and births, offering the earliest evidence of Chinese writing. Think of it: a king asking if rain would fall, and scribes carefully inscribing both the question and the result. That's bureaucracy plus superstition plus proto-science in one smoky ritual. What all these rivers had in common was scale. When you can grow food for thousands, you need someone or several someones to decide who gets what, who defends the granaries, who digs the next canal. Governments, in their earliest form, were often little more than management committees for water and grain, with swords and spears backing them up. Temples and palaces rose not just to honor gods or kings, but to anchor a social system in which surplus flowed upward. Of course, surplus doesn't just sit quietly in granaries. It buys luxury: jewelry-carved ivories, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, spices and shells and fabrics all began moving along trade routes that stitched cities into a wider web. The more cities grew, the more they reached outward, hungry for metals, timber, and prestige goods. And with trade came not just wealth, but stories, gods, and technologies. Civilization was no longer a handful of villages, it was a patchwork quilt spread across continents. And yet the city was a paradox. Within its walls, safety at least compared to the open plain, but also disease crowding inequality. For the first time, you could live your whole life without growing your own food, without hunting, without knowing where your bread truly came from. That alienation would echo down the centuries, giving birth to philosophies that tried to explain what it meant to be human amid stone and smoke rather than grass and sky. Still, the allure was undeniable. Cities multiplied: Memphis, Thebes, Mohenjo-Daro, Anyang. Each became a stage where drama unfolded, wars, dynasties, inventions, collapses. And underpinning it all were rivers, muddy, moody, life-giving. To early civilizations, rivers weren't just waterways. They were God's veins of the earth, and sometimes tyrants. Worship of river deities reflected both gratitude and fear, because one flood too many or too few meant ruin. Imagine standing on a quay in Uruk at dusk, the Euphrates glowing bronze in the sun. Boats creak against their moorings, children chase each other across dusty courtyards, and scribes hurry home with clay tablets tucked under their arms. The air smells of baked bread beer and bitumen. The city hums with possibility and danger. It is both fragile and formidable. For the first time in history, humanity isn't merely surviving in nature, it is reshaping nature to serve collective dreams, carving the world into brick symbols and power structures. And so the rivers wrote the first chapters of human civilization, not with pens, but with floods, and silt with plows, and prayers with kings who claimed divine sanction, and scribes who dutifully recorded it. From these muddy waters rose monuments, myths, and the first long shadows of empire. Picture the clang of hammer on metal in a dim workshop 4,000 years ago. Sparks fly, the smell of charcoal hangs thick, and a craftsman lifts something that gleams more brightly than stone or copper ever could bronze. Harder, sharper, more durable bronze was the superhero alloy of its day, forged from copper and tin metals rarely found in the same place. To make it, you needed trade networks, trust, and sometimes a little theft. And in binding distant mines and ports together, bronze helped knit a world that glittered with wealth, but teetered on fragile connections. The so-called Bronze Age, roughly 3000 to 1200 BCE, depending on where you stood on the globe, wasn't a single culture, but a shimmering web stretching from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia, from the Indus Valley to China. In Mesopotamia, city-states like Ur, and later Babylon, built ziggurats that loomed over plains, step pyramids of mud brick that announced to all the gods live here, and their representatives collect your taxes. In Egypt, pharaohs of the Middle and New Kingdoms presided over an empire of temples, trade expeditions, and an army wielding bronze-tipped spears. Farther west on Crete, the Minoans decorated palace walls with dolphins and acrobats leaping over bulls' art so lively you can almost hear the sea foam. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaeans built citadels with walls so strong they must have been raised by giants, or so later Greeks believed. What tied these cultures together wasn't just proximity, it was trade. Copper from Cyprus, tin from as far as Afghanistan or Cornwall, lapis, lazuli from Bactria, cedar from Lebanon, ivory from Africa, spices from India, all of it shuttled across land routes and sea lanes. Imagine the bustle at Ugarit, a port city on the Levantine coast, merchants shouting in Akkadian Egyptian and Mycenaean tongues, ships creaking with amphorae of wine, and oil scribes tallying cargo on clay tablets. The world was becoming cosmopolitan in miniature. Bronze itself was both symbol and substance of this web. Without tin, you had no bronze. Without bronze, you lacked the prestige weapons, tools, and ornaments that elite power depended on. Thus, kings became not just warriors and priests, but trade managers, ensuring that supply chains stretched unbroken across deserts and seas. And as anyone who has waited impatiently for a package knows, the more complex the network, the more vulnerable it becomes. It was an age of palaces as much as pyramids. Palatial complexes like Knossos weren't just royal residences. They were bureaucratic engines redistributing grain, olive oil, wool. Storage rooms brimmed with giant pithoi jars, taller than a man, lined up like silent sentinels. Linear B tablets from Mycenae list allocations of oil, bronze, and textiles with the cold precision of an accountant. Civilization, once based on irrigation and harvest, now ran on bureaucracy and ledgers. But prosperity carried shadows. Elite competition spurred arms races. Bronze-tipped chariots became the sports cars of the late Bronze Age battlefield, fast, terrifying symbols of status. Maintaining them required specialized craftsman horses and training all costly. The very technology that gave rulers dominance also chained them to fragile economic and social structures. And then around 1200 BCE, the web tore. The collapse of the late Bronze Age is one of history's great cliffhangers. Almost simultaneously, great centers from Mycenae to Hattusa to Ugarit fell silent. Letters begged for grain that never came, cities were burned, palaces abandoned. In Egypt, inscriptions speak of mysterious sea peoples sweeping across the Mediterranean in a wave of raids and migrations. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, once powerful enough to challenge pharaohs, vanished like a sandcastle at high tide. Was it climate change? Drought seems to have withered harvests across the eastern Mediterranean. Was it earthquakes? Some sites show rubble consistent with tremors. Was it rebellious peasants, restive mercenaries, or migrating groups displaced by famine? Probably all of the above. The very interconnection that had fueled the Bronze Age trade routes, supply chains' reliance on imported tin, meant that when one link snapped, the shock rippled outward. Imagine being a merchant in Ugarit in its final days. You've heard rumors of famine inland, of strange ships on the horizon. You've got warehouses full of goods, tablets full of debts owed, and a nervous feeling in your gut that none of it will matter if the walls fall. You send out a clay tablet letter. Send troops, send grain. But before the reply comes, the city is ash and silence. Archaeologists have found such tablets, frozen mid-plea, never delivered. History sometimes keeps receipts even for catastrophes. Out of the ruins came change. With long-distance trade, disrupted people turned to resources closer at hand. And in that pivot, iron began to rise. Unlike bronze iron ore, was common in many regions. True early iron wasn't always superior. Smelting, it was tricky, and poor iron could be brittle. But once mastered, iron was plentiful enough to arm whole populations, not just elites. The monopoly of palace chariot lords gave way to armies of foot soldiers with iron swords and spears. The balance of power shifted. The Bronze Age collapse cleared the stage for new players. In Greece, city-states would eventually rise from the Dark Age ashes, bearing epics about heroes like Agamemnon and Achilles, half memory, half myth of the world that had burned. In the Levant, small kingdoms like Israel and Phoenicia emerged, their sailors carrying goods and alphabets across the Mediterranean. In Mesopotamia, new empires like Assyria sharpened their claws. Egypt, bruised but unbroken, limped on. Civilization, it turns out, isn't a straight climb up a staircase. It's more like walking on a rickety rope bridge. Sometimes the planks give way, and you find yourself dangling, wondering if the whole thing will collapse. But humans are stubborn bridge crossers. Out of the Bronze Age's glitter and ruin came iron new states, new ideas. The world didn't end, it just rebooted with a different soundtrack of clashing metal. So when we talk about the Bronze Age, remember both the brilliance and the fragility. Palaces humming with trade art, dazzling with color tablets, alive with myth, and then silence, fire, and change. It's a reminder that even the most sophisticated systems, from palace archives to global supply chains, can unravel when too many stresses converge. The lattice of bronze was beautiful, but it couldn't hold forever. Out of the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse, as new kingdoms and empires rose on the shifting sands, something remarkable began to happen, not only in one place, but in many corners of the Old World. Across the vast sweep of Eurasia, from the rocky hills of Greece to the plains of India and the river valleys of China, people began asking bigger, sharper questions. Questions that didn't stop at how do we plant our crops or who gets the throne, but wandered into the mysterious territory of what is justice, what makes life meaningful, and how should we treat one another. Historians sometimes call this stretch of centuries, roughly 800 to 200 BCE, the Axial Age, as if the world tilted on an intellectual axis. Whether you buy the label or not, the pattern is undeniable. Teachers, prophets, and philosophers appeared in different societies, offering new visions of truth and morality. Their ideas still ripple through our daily lives, whether we're quoting Confucius on respect, referencing Socrates on ethics, or recalling the Buddha's Four Noble Truths in a yoga class that also sells scented candles. In China, during the chaos of the spring and autumn period, when rival states squabbled and warlords turned farmland into battlefields, a scholar named Kong Fuzi, whom we know as Confucius, tried to restore order with words rather than swords. He taught that harmony grew from relationships, parent and child ruler, and subject friend and friend. If everyone cultivated virtue, respect, benevolence, duty, the state itself would hum like a well-tuned zither. His Analects are still read today sometimes on subway commutes, where respect for fellow passengers might feel like a lost art. At nearly the same time, Taoist thinkers like Laozi whispered a counterpoint. Why fuss with rigid rules and rituals? Why not flow with the Tao the way, like water over stones? To live naturally, simply without forcing the world into brittle hierarchies, that was wisdom too. One could say, humanity was already debating the work-life balance problem 2,500 years ago. Head west, and you find another ferment. In the dusty towns of India, Siddhartha Gautama, born a prince, restless and dissatisfied, sat beneath a tree and resolved not to rise until he found the truth of suffering. He emerged as the Buddha, the Enlightened One, preaching a path of moderation, compassion, and mindfulness. Life is full of suffering, he said, but suffering can be understood, lessened, even transcended. His followers carried the message from the Ganges plain across mountains and deserts, planting seeds of Buddhism from Sri Lanka to China. Meanwhile, the Upanishads were being composed texts that wrestled with the soul, Atman, the cosmic order Brahman, and the idea that beneath the flux of the world lay a deeper unity. The Near East, too, was alive with voices. The Hebrew prophets thundered about justice, mercy, and the responsibilities of rulers and commoners alike. They challenged kings, condemned oppression, and insisted that true power lay with a single God who demanded ethical behavior, not just ritual sacrifice. Their visions would echo through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, shaping billions of lives long after their words were first shouted in marketplaces or whispered in exile. And then, of course, Greece. Picture Athens in the 5th century BCE, a noisy democracy with citizens crammed into the agora, debating everything from trade to war to the proper size of a statue's nose. Here, philosophy became a public sport. Socrates prowled the streets like an intellectual gadfly, poking holes in pretensions, asking simple questions that led to complicated discomfort. What is virtue? Can it be taught? If you think you know the answer, Socrates would probably argue you into knots until you weren't so sure. His student Plato built dialogues that explored ideals, justice, truth, the structure of the soul. Plato's student Aristotle tried to systematize everything from logic to biology to ethics, the intellectual equivalent of an overachiever who color codes every shelf. These figures didn't all agree. Confucius and Socrates might have quarreled about the role of authority. Laozi might have chuckled at Aristotle's fondness for categories. But they all shared a conviction that life wasn't just a series of harvests and wars. It was also a puzzle of meaning, a question of how to live well. In this sense, the so-called axial thinkers provided humanity with new maps, not of rivers and mountains, but of morality, spirit, and reason. It's tempting to imagine some cosmic coordination, as if divine Wi-Fi suddenly boosted signal strength worldwide. In truth, similar conditions likely fostered this flowering societies, growing larger, more complex, more anxious. Old mythologies no longer soothed as easily. People wanted explanations that matched the turbulence around them. When kingdoms rise and fall like dice rolls, when wealth and misery rub shoulders in crowded markets, it's only natural to ask, what is justice? What is suffering? What is the right path? And these questions, once voiced, were contagious. Pilgrims carried Buddhist sutras along caravan trails. Traders brought fragments of Greek philosophy eastward. Jewish communities in Babylon and beyond spread prophetic visions. Ideas hitched rides with goods just as surely as tin and silk once had. The Silk Road, in its earliest form, wasn't just a highway of spices and textiles. It was a highway of wisdom, doubt, and debate. If you were a villager in 500 BCE, did you feel the tremors of this intellectual earthquake? Probably not. Daily life still meant planting, herding, paying taxes, dodging disease. But in temples, academies, groves, and caves, new seeds were sprouting. Over centuries, those seeds would grow into institutions, scriptures, and traditions that still shape how we raise children, teach students, and ponder morality at 3 a.m. when sleep won't come. So, as the Bronze Age palaces lay in ruins and iron swords gleamed in the hands of new armies, something subtler but equally momentous was happening. Humanity, for perhaps the first time on such a scale, was looking inward toward ethics, toward the self, toward invisible truths. This was the age of questions, and the answers, partial and fragile though they were, proved durable enough to survive empires. The harvests would still rise and fall. Wars would still rage. But now, threaded through the noise of history, a quieter chorus could be heard, voices of teachers and prophets asking us not just how to survive, but how to live. Imagine yourself on a sun-baked stone road somewhere in Italy around the year 100 CE. The dust clings to your sandals, the air hums with cicadas, and in the distance you hear the rhythmic clop of hooves and the squeak of wagon wheels. A Roman milestone stands nearby, carved in Latin letters, announcing how many miles to the next town. That stone is more than a marker. It is a symbol of one of history's most ambitious projects, empires so vast that roads, taxes, and armies were needed to hold them together. Two of these empires, Rome in the west and Han China in the east, stood like bookends across the continent of Eurasia. Both flourished in the centuries straddling the beginning of our Common Era. Both organized millions of people under centralized states, and both set patterns that influenced political life for millennia. Yet they were also startlingly different in culture, language, and worldview. Picture the Roman Senate's marble halls echoing with debates in Latin, and the Han court at Chang'an humming with the brushstrokes of Confucian scholars. Two worlds, two traditions, but oddly parallel stories. Let's start in Rome. From its humble origins as a scrappy city-state on the Tiber, Rome expanded with relentless energy, conquering Italy, then the Mediterranean, then reaching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. By the time of Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain's damp hills to the deserts of Mesopotamia. Soldiers, administrators, tax collectors, and merchants spread Roman law coinage and architecture everywhere they went. The result was a kind of patchwork unity. Local gods still received offerings. Celtic or Punic languages still whispered in markets, but over it all loomed Latin law, Roman roads, and imperial authority. A Roman road straight as an arrow across hills and valleys was a marvel of engineering. Layered with stone and gravel, crowned for drainage, and lined with milestones. It allowed legions to march quickly, merchants to move goods, and officials to communicate across enormous distances. All roads lead to Rome, people said. And it was nearly true. The city at the empire's heart sucked in grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, spices from Arabia, and slaves from almost everywhere. Rome's population swelled to 1 million, a staggering figure for the ancient world. Imagine the noise hawkers in markets, hammers in workshops, senators in debate, gladiators in arenas. A city that never truly slept. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Han dynasty presided over its own mighty state. Founded after the collapse of the short-lived Qin, the Han emperors built a system that endured for centuries, earning later generations the proud name People of Han. The capital at Chang'an glittered with palaces, towers, and bustling markets. The bureaucracy, steeped in Confucian classics, administered taxes, justice, and labor corvée with paper documents and ink brushes. Where Rome loved its legal codes and citizen assemblies, Han China loved its moral order, emperors as sons of heaven, ruling under the mandate of cosmic harmony, advised by scholars quoting Confucius with solemn authority. The Han also built roads, but perhaps even more impressive, they extended walls, fortifications along the northern frontier to keep out steppe nomads. They sent armies against the Xiongnu horse lords and forged alliances through marriage and tribute. At the same time, they turned outward in trade. Caravans carried silk, that shimmering treasure, westward through oases and deserts. Roman writers marveled at this cloth so fine it seemed woven from air, though they had little idea where it truly came from. Gold and silver flowed eastward in return. Thus began what we call the Silk Road, though in reality it was less a single road than a tangled network of paths, markets, and middlemen stretching from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Imagine being a merchant somewhere in Central Asia, perhaps in Samarkand or Kashgar. In your caravan yard, camels chew lazily, while bales of silk, jars of glassware, and sacks of spices change hands. You hear fragments of Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Chinese. A Roman coin with the emperor's face passes from hand to hand, eventually ending up in a Chinese merchant's pouch. Goods moved slowly, but ideas moved with them. Buddhism crept eastward into China, while artistic motifs and technologies like paper and glassware crept westward. What made Rome and Han so similar wasn't just scale, but the constant balancing act of empire. Both had to deal with rebellions, corruption, and the expense of maintaining vast armies. Both relied on a blend of conquest, assimilation, and infrastructure. Both cultivated myths of unity: Rome as the eternal city, Han China as the center of heaven and earth. And both left legacies that endured long after their fall. Roman law influencing Europe, Han, ideals shaping East Asia. Yet the differences were telling too. Rome extended citizenship, gradually weaving conquered peoples into its legal fabric. A Spaniard, a Syrian, or even a freed slave could in time become Roman. In China, by contrast, identity revolved around cultural assimilation. To be Han was to adopt Confucian norms, Chinese language, Chinese customs. Rome's unity was legalistic. China's was cultural. Different glue, but both sticky enough to hold. Life under these empires could be grand or grim, depending on your station. An aristocrat in Rome might recline at banquets, sipping wine and debating philosophy, while a peasant in Gaul trudged behind an ox, paying taxes that seemed to multiply like rabbits. In Han China, a scholar official could enjoy prestige and security, while a farmer might be crushed by corvée, labor on a wall or canal. Yet even the humblest villager felt the reach of empire, the coin in their hand, the law that punished theft, the road that led to markets. By the 2nd century CE, both empires stood at their peak, and both were already fraying. Rome faced pressures on its frontiers from Germanic tribes and Parthians, while corruption and overextension drained resources. In China, court intrigues, eunuch power, and peasant uprisings like the Yellow Turbans shook stability. Neither empire collapsed overnight. Both lingered for centuries, staggering through reform attempts and civil wars. But the symmetry is striking: two giants straddling continents, rising almost in tandem, declining in eerily parallel arcs. If you were to soar like an eagle or a dragon over Eurasia around 100 CE, you'd see the roads glinting stone-paved in Italy, dusty caravan trails in Gansu. You'd see cities glowing with torchlight armies drilling scholars scratching on parchment or bamboo slips. And you'd sense that something new had dawned: the idea that humans could create systems so vast they stretched horizons, binding millions into one polity. Rome and Han were not eternal, yet their roads, laws, and ideals carved deep grooves into human history. Even now, echoes linger: our words for law republic and citizen trace back to Rome. The very notion of China as a cultural and political core traces back to Han. Two great empires, two sets of roads meeting, though faintly through the whispers of silk and silver, carried by caravans across deserts. And so, as dust settles on a Roman milestone and snow falls on a Han frontier fort, we stand at a moment when the world felt both vast and connected. Empires had learned to rule not just villages or valleys, but continents. The stage was set for new faiths, new transformations, and new collisions. Close your eyes and imagine the echo of footsteps in a crumbling Roman forum. Weeds sprout between the stones, statues lean askew, and the once bright marble has dulled under centuries of sun and soot. It's the 5th century CE, and something is ending. Not life, not culture, those persist in their stubborn human way, but the grandeur of Rome as it had been known. And as the empire frays, something else is stirring in the corners of the world: faiths new and old maps, redrawn identities transformed. 476 CE has become shorthand for the fall of Rome, but that's more a convenient bookmark than a cataclysmic full stop. The truth is messier. The Western Roman Empire staggered under the weight of economic troubles, military overreach, and relentless pressure from migrating peoples. Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, groups seeking land security and maybe a little revenge for centuries of imperial bullying. In 410, the Visigoths sacked Rome itself, shocking a world that had long believed the Eternal City was untouchable. By 476, the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, poor kid carrying the name of both Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor, was deposed. But to many farmers tilling fields in Gaul or Italy, life went on. The tax collector might now wear a Gothic cloak instead of a Roman toga, but the wheat still had to be planted. In the east, meanwhile, Constantinople gleamed. Founded by Constantine in the early 4th century as New Rome, it thrived, while its western sibling decayed. Protected by stout walls perched between Europe and Asia, and nourished by trade through the Bosporus, it would endure for another 1,000 years. If you'd walked its streets around 500 CE, you'd have seen markets buzzing with silks and spices domes, and churches rising, bureaucrats filing scrolls in Greek, not Latin. Rome had fallen, yes, but in Constantinople, it was still very much alive, simply wearing new colors. This period, we call late antiquity, wasn't just about crowns slipping and frontiers shifting. It was about the spread of new ideas, particularly faith. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, whispered about in Roman taverns, now stood triumphant. In 313, Constantine had issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians the right to worship freely. By the end of the 4th century, Theodosius Thurs, declared Christianity the state religion. Temples that once rang with hymns to Jupiter fell silent, replaced by basilicas echoing with chants to Christ. Imagine the disorientation your grandmother still offering incense to household gods, while your grandchildren are baptized under a bishop's watchful eye. Christianity itself was changing too hardening into institutions. Bishops wielded authority rivaling that of governors. Councils gathered to argue doctrine. Was Christ fully divine, fully human? Both the debates were heated, sometimes bloody. The Nicene Creed, hammered out in 325, was meant to unify belief, but schisms still splintered communities. Faith was no longer just personal. It was political imperial, a glue to bind diverse peoples under one God and one empire. Nor was Christianity the only voice in the chorus. Judaism, resilient through exile and diaspora, continued to define itself through texts and traditions, even as synagogues faced restrictions. Zoroastrianism thrived in Persia, its dualistic vision of good and evil influencing not just its own followers, but later religious thought. In India, Hinduism crystallized into enduring forms of devotion to Vishnu Shiva and the goddess, while Buddhism spread along trade routes, adapting to each culture it touched. Late antiquity was an age when faith and philosophy spilled across borders like rivers after a storm. And what of Islam? Not yet, not quite. By the 6th century, the Arabian Peninsula was a crossroads of trade and belief, buzzing with caravan routes and tribal loyalties. Pagan shrines stood alongside Jewish communities and Christian monasteries. Within a century, though, Muhammad would receive his revelations, and a new faith would surge outward, but that's for the next part of our journey. For now, we linger on the cusp, when the old world still breathed, but the new one was stirring in its chest. If you zoomed out on a map between 300 and 600 CE, the patchwork looks chaotic. Western Europe fragmented into kingdoms of Goths, Franks, and Lombards. In the east, the Byzantine Empire flexed its muscles, reconquering parts of Italy and North Africa under Justinian, who also left behind the Hagia Sophia's soaring dome and a legal code that lawyers still nod to today. To the south and east, the Persian Sasanian Empire held sway, locked in a long, wearying rivalry with Byzantium. In northern India, the Gupta Empire oversaw a flourishing of mathematics, astronomy, and literature, a golden age, where scholars calculated the concept of zero, and poets like Kalidasa wrote plays that still dazzle. In China, the Han dynasty had fallen, and centuries of division followed, but Buddhism poured in, reshaping art, philosophy, and daily life. It was a time when maps redrew themselves almost annually, but also when cultural seeds were planted that would flower for centuries. Latin might fade in Western Europe, but its offspring, French, Spanish, Italian, took root. Germanic kingdoms would someday grow into nations. Christianity's spread laid the foundation for medieval Europe. In Byzantium, Greek learning was preserved to be passed later into the Renaissance. In India and China, philosophies and religions evolved in ways that would shape entire civilizations. And yet, it was not all lofty shifts of doctrine and empire. Ordinary life could be precarious. Plagues swept through populations weakened by war and famine. The Justinian plague in the 6th century killed millions, a grim foreshadowing of pandemics to come. Cities shrank, trade routes faltered. In some places, life looked poorer, meaner, less connected than in the glory days of Rome or Han. This is why some historians call it a dark age, though that label hides as much as it reveals. Darkness, for whom perhaps for elites who missed their marble baths and imported spices. But for a farmer, no longer paying crushing taxes to a distant emperor, life might not have felt so grim. So what is late antiquity really? Not a fall, but a transformation. Old crowns toppled, yes, but new ones gleamed. Old gods faded, but new faiths surged. Maps blurred, then redrew. It was as if humanity, exhausted from centuries of empire building, took a long, restless breath, half sigh, half gasp, before plunging into the medieval world. Picture again that Roman forum at dusk, columns cracked grass creeping through the stones. A bishop delivers a sermon where a senator once gave a speech. Children play among the ruins, their laughter echoing off marble carved by forgotten sculptors. Life continues differently. The old world is not dead. It has been refashioned. Out of the rubble of Rome and the restless energy of Asia, a new age begins to murmur, preparing to roar. Picture the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century. A vast desert, yes, but not empty caravan routes, stitched oases and coastal towns together, carrying frankincense spices and silks. Camels plodded in long lines, their padded feet soft against the sand, while traders shouted in bustling markets from Mecca to Medina. At night, stars blazed so brilliantly that they seemed close enough to touch guiding nomads across the dunes. Amid this landscape of tribes and trade shrines and squabbles, a revelation would change not just Arabia, but the world. In 610 CE, in a cave on Mount Hira, near Mecca, Muhammad ibn Abdullah experienced his first vision. The words he received recite would be remembered as the start of the Quran, Islam's holy book. Over the next 2 decades, Muhammad preached that there was one God, merciful and just, who called humanity to faith, compassion, and community. This message unsettled Mecca's elites, who thrived on polytheistic pilgrimages to the Kaaba and feared disruption of the lucrative trade tied to those rituals. Conflict followed, and Muhammad and his followers migrated to Medina in 622, a journey known as the Hijra, which became year 1 of the Islamic calendar. From those modest beginnings, Islam spread with astonishing speed. By Muhammad's death in 632, Arabia was largely united under the banner of a new faith. Within a century, his successors, the caliphs, oversaw a vast empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the borders of India. Imagine the sheer-scale deserts, mountains, and seas traversed by armies, merchants, and pilgrims, all bound by a shared scripture and a simple declaration of faith. But Islam was not just about conquest. It was about connection. The early caliphates, the Rashidun, the Umayyad, and then the Abbasid, wove together regions that had once been fragmented by old empires. Arabic became not only a language of prayer, but of administration, trade, and science. Cities flourished: Damascus, with its grand mosque, Cordoba, with its libraries, and most famously, Baghdad, founded in 762 as the Abbasid capital. Baghdad wasn't merely a seat of power, it was a beacon of learning. Picture the House of Wisdom in the 9th century shelves, groaning with manuscripts in Arabic, Greek, Sanskrit, and Persian. Scholars hunched over scrolls, translating, debating, scribbling notes in the margins. Here, the knowledge of ancient civilizations was not only preserved, but expanded. Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian astronomy, all were studied, critiqued, and developed. Algebra was formalized, algorithms named stars, cataloged medicines tested, while parts of Europe stumbled through what later generations dubbed the Dark Ages. Baghdad glowed with intellectual light. And this knowledge didn't stay locked in Baghdad. Paper, first invented in China, spread westward along trade routes and found eager hands in Islamic lands. Libraries multiplied, texts became more accessible, and ideas traveled with merchants and scholars. From the astrolabe used to chart stars for navigation to treatises on optics that anticipated modern physics, the contributions of Islamic scholars would eventually filter into Europe, fueling the Renaissance centuries later. The world, in a very real sense, owes part of its scientific inheritance to that house of wisdom and its restless scribes. Of course, empires are never just about scholarship. The caliphates were political machines too prone to power struggles, dynastic feuds, and territorial ambitions. The Umayyads expanded west into Spain and east into Central Asia, establishing Arabic as the dominant tongue from the Pyrenees to the Indus. Yet their dynasty was toppled in 750, replaced by the Abbasids, who shifted the center eastward to Baghdad. Even then, unity was fragile. Provinces like Al-Andalus in Spain charted their own paths, producing their own blend of cultures, Arab-Berber, Jewish-Christian, under the arching domes of Cordoba's mosque. For ordinary people, daily life under Islamic rule varied. In cities, markets teemed with spices, fabrics, and stories. In rural villages, farmers irrigated fields, paid taxes, and celebrated festivals. Jews and Christians, recognized as people of the book, were allowed to practice their faiths under a system of dhimmi status, paying special taxes but retaining communities and traditions. This pluralism wasn't perfect persecution flared at times, but compared to many other pre-modern empires, it allowed a surprising degree of coexistence. The spiritual core of Islam remained simple yet profound: the 5 pillars profession of faith, prayer, almsgiving, fasting during Ramadan, and pilgrimage to Mecca. Every year, pilgrims from across the empire converged on the Kaaba, circling it as Muhammad once had, uniting shepherds, scholars, and sultans alike. Imagine the hum of thousands of voices chanting in unison, the swirl of white robes against the desert sun, a ritual that continues to this day. And yet, as Islam expanded, so too did questions. Who should lead the faithful after Muhammad's death? Was authority hereditary, passing through his family, or chosen by consensus of the community? These debates split the community into Sunni and Shia branches, a division that endures with profound consequences even now. Political schisms layered upon theological ones, shaping dynasties and rebellions for centuries. Still, the larger picture of the early Islamic centuries is one of dynamism. Merchants from Cairo to Samarkand carried not only goods, but also poetry, law, and architecture. Mosques rose with graceful minarets. Geometric art and calligraphy adorned walls, avoiding human figures in deference to religious sensibilities. In gardens, water flowed through channels symbolizing paradise itself. The desert faith had blossomed into a civilization of cities, ships, and scholars. Meanwhile, the wider world felt the tremors. Europe, fractured into post-Roman kingdoms, encountered Islam through trade and war, sometimes in the markets of Sicily or Provence, sometimes on battlefields like Tours. In India, Islam entered through traders and conquerors, layering new traditions atop ancient Hindu and Buddhist ones. In Africa, across the Sahara, caravans laden with salt and gold linked Islamic North Africa with kingdoms like Mali and Ghana, spreading faith and wealth alike. If you step back and squint, you see a pattern where once the Mediterranean had been Rome's lake. Now the Islamic caliphates made it part of a much larger system, stretching across continents. They inherited the roads of empire-added sea lanes of their own, and turned the known world into a humming network of exchange. The desert light of Islam illuminated not only faith, but commerce, art, and science. Picture Baghdad at its height, lanterns glowing along the Tigris, scholars debating in candlelit halls, merchants haggling in bazaars scented with cinnamon and cardamom. A city alive with the confidence of a civilization that believed God had entrusted humanity with both revelation and reason. And though no empire lasts forever, the legacy of that moment, the Quran recited the house of wisdom, buzzing the caravans rolling out toward distant horizons, has echoed through every century since. Let the desert winds of the caliphates settle for a moment and shift your gaze eastward across the steppes and mountains until you find the green valleys of China. It is the early 7th century, and a new dynasty has just risen, the Tang. If the Abbasids lit Baghdad like a lantern of knowledge, the Tang turned Chang'an into a galaxy. Imagine a city of nearly 2 million souls, its wide boulevards lined with lanterns, foreign envoys in silk and fur, Buddhist monks chanting in Sanskrit, Turkish horsemen swaggering through markets, and merchants unloading bolts of cloth jade and fragrant spices. Chang'an was the pivot of the world, a cosmopolitan stage where the Silk Road met the South China Sea. The Tang Dynasty, 618-907, became a golden age of poetry, art, and statecraft. Its emperors, at least at first, had the confidence to welcome outside influences. Buddhism poured in along caravan trails, blending with Taoist mysticism and Confucian ethics. Sculptors carved serene Buddhas into cave walls. Painters filled scrolls with rolling landscapes and poets. Oh, the poets captured the ache and beauty of life with delicate brushstrokes of ink. Li Bai wrote of moonlight and wine. Du Fu lamented the sorrows of war and exile. Their verses still ripple through Chinese schoolrooms today, like faint echoes from the banquet halls of the Tang. But Tang greatness was not just literary. The dynasty refined administration, strengthening the examination system that chose officials not by birth, but by merit, or at least by one's ability to memorize Confucian classics under extreme pressure. Think of it as the original standardized test, except failure meant not disappointing your parents, but losing the chance at power and prestige. For centuries, this system would funnel ambitious young men into government, creating a scholar official class whose brushstrokes wielded more force than swords. At its height, the Tang commanded tribute from Korea, Central Asia, and Vietnam. Its armies, armored and disciplined, clashed with Arabs at the Battle of Talas in 751, a reminder that the Silk Road wasn't just about friendly merchants, but also about rival empires meeting in dust and blood. Yet even in defeat, China gained something remarkable. Paper-making technology carried westward would transform Islamic lands and later Europe. History loves these ironic exchanges. Sometimes you lose a battle but win the library. By the 10th century, the Tang had faltered under rebellion and court intrigue, but China did not crumble into darkness. Instead, a new dynasty, the Song 960-1279, brought a different kind of brilliance, less imperial swagger, more economic revolution. If the Tang were poets and conquerors, the Song were inventors, engineers, and merchants. Imagine walking through Kaifeng, the Song capital. Bustling markets overflow with goods, silk robes, porcelain bowls that gleam like iced tea leaves, packed into bricks, fish still flapping from riverboats. Shops advertise with painted signs, street performers draw crowds, restaurants serve steaming noodles at communal tables. It is an urban vibrancy that feels startlingly modern. Marco Polo wouldn't arrive until centuries later, but if he had, he might have mistaken Song China for the future. This was the age when paper money first fluttered into purses, a government experiment to ease the burden of lugging heavy copper coins. Printing blossomed too. Woodblock prints churned out sutras, calendars, and cheap novels. Literacy spread beyond elites. Ordinary people could buy a book for the price of a meal. Gunpowder initially mixed for alchemy, and fireworks began to find military uses. Flaming arrows, primitive bombs. The compass, perfected in Song workshops, guided ships across open seas, linking China more firmly to maritime trade. It is no exaggeration to say that many of the tools that later transformed the world first sparked here under the patient hands of Song artisans. Economically, Song China pulsed with innovation. Farmers in the south planted fast-ripening rice from Vietnam, doubling harvests and feeding a population that soared past 100 million. Iron production boomed, Kilns blazed with porcelain destined for far-off markets. Merchants grew wealthy, and with wealth came social shifts and increasingly sophisticated culture of urban entertainment, from tea houses and theaters to courtesans and storytellers. You could wander Kaifeng, or later Hangzhou, and find yourself dazzled, overstimulated, perhaps even lost in what historians call the world's first commercial revolution. Yet brilliance often has shadows. The Song struggled militarily pressured by nomadic states along their borders. The Liao Jin, and eventually the Mongols harassed and invaded, forcing the dynasty to retreat southward. Despite their wealth and innovation, the Song never achieved the territorial dominance of the Tang. Their legacy lay not in conquering others, but in cultivating a dense, sophisticated society that became a model for centuries. And China's neighbors were not idle spectators. Korea, under the Silla and later Goryeo dynasties, absorbed Confucian ideals and Buddhist art, sending tribute to China while shaping its own identity. Japan borrowed Chinese characters, architecture, and bureaucracy, yet remixed them into something distinctly Japanese, complete with Shinto shrines and samurai codes. Vietnam, too, lived under Chinese influence, but forged its own blend of Confucian exams and local traditions, stubbornly defending independence with equal parts diplomacy and rebellion. East Asia, in this period, was a zone of cultural fluorescence, a great conversation in stone ink and trade goods. A Japanese monk might study in Tang China and return with sutras and new temple designs. A Korean craftsman might export Celadon pottery, coveted across the region. Vietnamese rice would help feed Chinese cities. The exchanges were constant, subtle, and transformative. If you zoom out, the Tang and Song centuries reveal a pattern. While Europe was fragmenting into feudal kingdoms and the Islamic world was dazzling with caliphal grandeur, East Asia was quietly assembling a toolkit of technologies and cultural institutions that would ripple far beyond its borders. From noodles to gunpowder printing to porcelain, the gifts of the East would shape global history in ways neither Tang emperors nor Song merchants could have fully imagined. Picture the dawn over Hangzhou, the Song capital in its later years. The Grand Canal gleams with barges, the air smells of tea and sesame oil, and bells from Buddhist temples mingle with hawkers' cries. Somewhere in a shop, a freshly printed booklet lies waiting for a curious reader. Somewhere in a workshop, black powder hisses in a bamboo tube, startling its maker with unexpected force. The Eastern Dawn is not just a metaphor. It is the spark of a world that is already turning toward modernity, centuries before the word itself would be coined. Let's drift now from the buzzing streets of Hangzhou back toward a quieter, rougher landscape medieval Europe. The year is somewhere around 1100 CE. Imagine mist clinging to the fields of northern France, peasants bending over plows pulled by oxen, the distant toll of a church bell calling the faithful to prayer. It is not Rome's marble grandeur, nor Baghdad's glittering markets, not Chang'an's grand boulevards, but something humbler, patchworked with farms, castles, monasteries, and cathedrals, climbing toward heaven, one stone at a time. After Rome's Western Empire unraveled, Europe didn't vanish into barbarism, though for a time it did look more rural, more fragmented, and less glamorous. Kings ruled shaky kingdoms, lords carved out fiefdoms, and peasants, the vast majority, lived tethered to land. This was the feudal order, a world where loyalty and protection were traded like currency. A peasant gave labor and harvest to a lord. The lord pledged service and soldiers to a king. And the king, well, often, he was juggling war's debts and an unruly nobility. Life on a medieval manor was both predictable and precarious. You rose at dawn, tended fields, worried about the weather, and paid dues in grain or labor. The wooden plow groaned through heavy soils, until in northern Europe, the heavy-wheeled plow and horse collar arrived turning thick earth into bread for swelling populations. The three-field system of crop rotation increased yields. Slowly, steadily agricultural improvements nudged Europe toward growth. But if the fields grounded Europe, its eyes were on the sky, or rather heaven. The church was everywhere, a parish in every village, a monastery in every valley, a cathedral rising in every town that could afford one. Picture Notre Dame in Paris, as its stones were first laid in the 12th century scaffolds, groaning masons, chiseling gargoyles waiting to perch on rooftops. Cathedrals weren't just religious spaces. They were community projects, economic engines, and artistic showcases rolled into one. To walk inside a Gothic cathedral, with its soaring arches and colored light pouring through stained glass, was to step into a vision of eternity carved from stone. Monasteries hummed with a quieter rhythm. Monks in scriptoria bent over parchment, copying not only Bibles, but fragments of classical learning. Aristotle, Cicero, Galen, preserving them for an age when they'd be rediscovered. In an age before printing, a monk's quill was as valuable as a knight's sword. Meanwhile, monasteries also brewed beer, kept herb gardens, and provided food and shelter for travelers. They were in their way both spiritual centers and engines of local economies. Europe's landscape was far from peaceful. Castles dotted the hills, symbols of both defense and oppression. Knights thundered across battlefields, their armor gleaming their code of chivalry, equal parts brutal reality and romantic myth. Feuds between lords, raids by Vikings in earlier centuries, and the great clashes of crusades later on all kept the continent's swords sharp and its peasants wary. Yet even in this martial world, culture found room to flourish. Troubadours sang of courtly love epics, like the Song of Roland, were recited and stained glass windows told biblical stories and glowing pictures for the illiterate faithful. Then in the 14th century came catastrophe. The Black Death arrived on ships borne by fleas on rats, sweeping across Europe with terrifying speed. Between 1347 and 1351, perhaps a third of the population died, some regions even more. Imagine the fear, neighbors dropping in the streets, whole villages abandoned priests, overwhelmed carts piled with bodies. The plague was not just a health crisis, but a social earthquake. Fields went untended, labor grew scarce, wages rose, and the old bonds of feudal obligation weakened. Some called it divine punishment. Others saw it as proof that the old order was failing. Yet from tragedy came transformation. Survivors inherited lands, towns adjusted laws, and guilds of craftsmen gained power. Peasants demanded better terms, and sometimes rose in revolt. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 marched to London shouting, "When Adam delved, and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" The question cut deep. If all are equal before God, why should nobles and kings rule? Still, even amid loss, Europe's creativity did not stop. Cathedrals continued to rise. Dante wrote his Divine Comedy, charting an epic journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. Chaucer penned the Canterbury Tales, a bawdy-clever collection of pilgrim stories. Universities sprouted in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Salamanca, small at first, but planting seeds of scholarship that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. Students argued Aristotle under candlelight, debated theology, and drank cheap ale in taverns between lectures. The medieval centuries were also about connections, though not always friendly ones. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, were a strange blend of pilgrimage, holy war, and political opportunism. Tens of thousands marched east to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control, leaving behind chaos mingling with Byzantine politics and briefly creating fragile crusader states. While often disastrous and bloodshed, the Crusades also widened horizons. Europeans tasted sugar, encountered new medicines, rediscovered Greek texts, preserved in Arabic, and learned navigational skills that would later fuel ocean voyages. Trade routes expanded. Italian cities like Venice and Genoa grew rich, ferrying goods across the Mediterranean. Hanseatic merchants in the north linked the Baltic to the North Sea. Markets bustled with cloth spices and salt, while fairs in places like Champagne drew traders from across the continent. Europe was still poorer and less urban than China or the Islamic world, but its appetite for goods and knowledge was growing. If you pause and listen to the rhythm of medieval Europe, you hear contrasts: the rustle of wheat in fields, the hammering of masons raising a cathedral, the chanting of monks at dawn, the toll of bells marking hours, the clash of swords in a feudal skirmish, the hushed prayers of plague survivors burying loved ones. It was a world both fragile and resilient, often violent, sometimes luminous, always human. And while later centuries would brand this time, the Middle Ages, as if it were merely a drab waiting room between antiquity and the Renaissance that sells it short, medieval Europe was an age of endurance and quiet innovation, of plows and cathedrals, guilds and guild halls, knights and nuns, despair and hope. Without its patient toil, its copied manuscripts, its stubborn peasants, and its daring builders, the later leaps of Renaissance and Enlightenment could never have happened. Picture now the close of a medieval day. The cathedral bells toll vesper prayers, smoke curls from cottage chimneys, and in the fading light, peasants trudge home from fields, while a scribe lights a candle to keep copying a manuscript. Overhead, the stars prick the sky. Tomorrow will bring more labor, more prayers, perhaps more trouble, but also more endurance. For in Europe, between cathedrals and plows, the story of the continent was being quietly, stubbornly written. Now let's turn our gaze southward to a continent too often left out of the sweeping world history narratives, though it should never be. Africa, in the medieval centuries, was not a silent, empty stage. It was alive with kingdoms, trade routes, storytellers, and stone cities that glittered under the sun. And at the same time, the Indian Ocean, stretching from East Africa to India and China, became one of the great highways of global history, humming with the steady rhythm of monsoon winds. Let's begin in West Africa. Imagine caravans snaking across the Sahara, hundreds of camels carrying salt from the desert's mines, gold from river valleys, and ideas that traveled as surely as any cargo. Out of this trade grew mighty kingdoms, most famously Ghana Mali, and later Songhai. The Kingdom of Ghana, not to be confused with the modern nation, flourished as early as the 8th century, controlling the flow of gold and taxing caravans that passed through. Its wealth dazzled travelers who spoke of kings adorned in gold jewelry, their courts gleaming like treasure chests under the sun. But it was Mali, founded in the 13th century, that truly captured the world's imagination. Its most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, reigned in the early 14th century and became legendary for his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. Imagine the sight: thousands of attendant soldiers and servants trudging across the desert camels laden with gold dust, Mansa Musa himself handing out so much wealth in Cairo that he supposedly disrupted local economies for years. To medieval Europe, struggling through famine and plague news of a king who seemed to bathe in gold must have sounded like fantasy. Yet Mali's prosperity rested not only on riches, but on learning. In Timbuktu, libraries swelled with manuscripts, scholars debated theology and law, and mosques rose with elegant minarets. Africa's story, too, was one of books as well as bullion. To the south, on the savannas and forests of Central and Southern Africa, other kingdoms thrived. In present-day Zimbabwe, between the 11th and 15th centuries, Masons built Great Zimbabwe, a city of massive stone walls without mortar, their curves enclosing royal enclosures and trading spaces. Standing before them today, you can still feel the power of a city that commanded cattle gold and ivory, exporting wealth eastward through coastal ports. European explorers, centuries later, refused to believe Africans had built such structures, an insult to the ingenuity of the people who carved stone into legacy. But archaeologists leave no doubt Great Zimbabwe was a center of African civilization tied into a global economy that stretched far beyond its hills. That economy found its highway in the Indian Ocean. Stand on the shore at Kilwa Kisiwani, a Swahili city-state off the coast of present-day Tanzania around the year 1400. Coral stone mosques rise from the island houses, with carved wooden doors face the sea, and dhows sleek sailing ships with triangular lateen sails bob in the harbor. The air smells of cloves, ivory, and fresh fish. Here the monsoon winds are the calendar. In one season they blow east, carrying ships from Africa toward India. In another, they sweep back west, bringing merchants home again. Trade followed these winds, reliable as clockwork, and linked continents together. The Swahili coast, stretching from Somalia down to Mozambique, was dotted with such towns: Mogadishu, Mombasa, Kilwa, Sofala. Each was independent, ruled by local elites, yet bound together by trade and culture. Their language, Swahili blended Bantu roots, with Arabic words reflecting centuries of interaction. Islam spread through these towns, brought by traders, and mosques rose alongside marketplaces. Merchants here dealt in ivory gold tortoiseshell, and slaves exporting them to Arabia, India, and beyond, while importing ceramics from China, textiles from Gujarat, and spices from Southeast Asia. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain shards on African beaches, proof that this was not a backwater, but a crucial node in a global system. Sail with those monsoon winds eastward, and the ocean becomes a web of connections. Indian ports like Calicut and Cambay bustled with spice traders, their warehouses stacked with pepper, cinnamon, and textiles. From there, goods moved onward to the Middle East and Europe. Even farther east, Chinese junks carried silk and porcelain into the Indian Ocean trade. The system was so efficient that a merchant could, in theory, order ceramics from China and receive them in Kilwa within a few years, a time frame that seems astonishing given the distances. The Indian Ocean, unlike the stormy Atlantic or Pacific, was a sailor's friend: predictable winds, seasonal rhythms, and a long tradition of navigational knowledge. But these networks were not only about goods. They carried ideas too. Islam spread deep into Africa and Asia through these routes, not always by conquest, but often by trade and conversion. Mosques and Mali minarets in Zanzibar, madrasas in the Maldives, all stand as monuments to a faith carried by sailors and scholars. Likewise, art styles, musical instruments, and stories traveled with merchants. A lute from the Middle East became the ancestor of the European guitar. African rhythms eventually shaped music across continents. The Indian Ocean was as much a sea of culture as of commerce. And behind these great movements of goods and ideas were people. Picture the griot in Mali, a storyteller-musician reciting the history of kings with chorus strings humming beneath his fingers. Picture a Swahili merchant negotiating in a crowded port, switching easily between languages as coins clink in his palm. Picture African miners sweating in shafts to extract the gold that would gleam in Indian markets or be hammered into coins in Venice. Civilizations are not just monuments or trade routes. They are human lives, often anonymous, whose labor and stories underpin the wealth of their rulers. Europe, meanwhile, only brushed against this world during these centuries. Venetian merchants coveted the spices and silks that ultimately flowed through Indian Ocean channels, but they reached them only by costly land and sea routes through the Middle East. This frustration would later fuel voyages of exploration that circled Africa and crashed into the Americas. For now, though, the Indian Ocean remained the domain of Africans, Arabs, Indians, and Chinese, a humming polyglot space, long before globalization became a buzzword. By the late medieval period, the richness of Africa and the Indian Ocean world was undeniable. Yet later, European narratives often dismissed these regions as marginal, as if history paused outside Europe's borders. In truth, without Africa's gold and ivory, without the spices and silks of the Indian Ocean, Europe's own economies and imaginations would have starved. These southern and eastern worlds weren't peripheral, they were central. Picture one last scene: the sun setting over the Indian Ocean, dhows silhouetted against the horizon, their sails taut with monsoon winds. On board, sailors chant prayers, merchants tally goods, and a boy dreams of distant lands. Beyond the horizon lies Arabia, or India, or perhaps China. Behind them, Africa's coasts glow with lamplight voices, rising in Swahili Arabic and countless local tongues. The ocean carries them season after season, a tide not just of water, but of history itself. Let us now cross oceans not on the caravels of Columbus, but centuries earlier in imagination. Picture the vast expanse of the Americas before European ships ever pierced their horizons. No sails yet on Atlantic waves, no hoofbeats of horses on the plains, only the societies that had grown layer by layer from the first peoples who crossed icy land bridges millennia before. By the first millennium CE, the Americas were not wilderness awaiting discovery, but a patchwork of civilizations, cities, humming with astronomers and stonecutters, empires stretching along mountains, markets bustling with cacao and feathers. Let's begin with the Maya, who flourished in the forests of Mesoamerica. Imagine standing in the plaza of Tikal, a city in today's Guatemala, sometime in the 8th century. Towering step pyramids rise like green-cloaked mountains, their tops piercing the canopy. Priests climb steep stairs, incense smoke curling toward the sky. Scribes paint codices on bark paper glyphs, as intricate as lace recording histories, rituals astronomy. The Maya tracked Venus with astonishing precision-planned calendars that meshed solar and ritual cycles and carved histories of kings and queens into stone stelae. Their ball courts rang with the slap of rubber balls and the cheers of spectators. Their cosmology imagined 3 layers of existence with the world tree binding them all together. But Maya life was not only lofty ritual. Farmers in surrounding fields coaxed maize beans and squash from thin soils. Traders moved obsidian jade cacao and feathers between city-states. And city-states they were Maya politics resembled Greece more than Rome. Rival cities, in alliance feud and war, sometimes flourishing together, sometimes tearing each other down. By the 9th century, many great centers were abandoned, likely from drought soil exhaustion and internecine conflict. Yet the Maya did not vanish. Their descendants still live across Central America, today languages and traditions echoing a legacy older than most European nations. Northwest of the Maya, another empire rose in central Mexico, the Aztec, though they called themselves Mexica. Their capital Tenochtitlan, founded on an island in Lake Texcoco in the 14th century, became one of the world's great cities. Imagine approaching it by canoe causeways, stretching across glittering water temples, rising at the center like painted mountains markets so vast that Spanish conquerors centuries later gaped in disbelief. Here, tens of thousands traded every imaginable good turkeys, chocolate obsidian blades, embroidered cloth, even human hair for wigs. The Aztecs built their empire through conquest, demanding tribute in goods and captives, weaving dozens of city-states into a web of dominance. Religiously, the Aztecs believed in cycles of creation and destruction, that the sun itself required nourishment. Hence, their infamous human sacrifices offerings meant to keep the cosmos balanced. To us, the rituals seem horrific. To the Aztecs, they were sacred duty. And yet, Aztec life was not only sacrifice and conquest. It was poetry art, elaborate gardens, education for both boys and girls, and an appreciation for beauty that infused even everyday objects. The city itself was a marvel of engineering aqueducts, carrying fresh water, chinampas, floating gardens, producing abundant crops, canals threading through neighborhoods like a watery grid. Further south, high in the Andes, rose the Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, the land of four quarters. Imagine terraced mountainsides stepping downward like giant staircases, stone walls hugging cliffs, and roads stretching for thousands of miles across valleys, deserts, and snow-capped peaks. The Inca knit together an empire that by the 15th century stretched over 2,500 miles from Ecuador to Chile. They ruled not with money, there was no coinage, but with labor and organization. Farmers owed the state mita, a tax of work, which the empire redirected to build roads, bridges, storehouses, and temples. Llamas carried loads along mountain trails. Runners relayed messages using knotted cords called quipu, which stored information in twists and colors rather than ink. Cusco, their capital, was laid out in the shape of a puma, a cosmic animal of strength. At its heart stood the temple of the sun walls, plated with gold that glimmered so brightly the Spanish conquerors later called it blinding. Yet the Inca genius was practical as well as sacred. They developed freeze-drying techniques for potatoes stored surplus food in mountain granaries, and devised rope bridges that spanned gorges with dizzying grace. Their society was rigid with strict hierarchies, but it held millions of people together in a system both fragile and astonishing. And beyond these great empires, the Americas teemed with diversity. In North America, the Mississippian culture built earthen mounds at Cahokia near modern St. Louis, creating a city with plazas, wood palisades, and a population of perhaps $20,000 at its peak around the 12th century. Imagine its central mound, Monk's Mound, rising nearly 100 feet, topped with a wooden structure that glowed with firelight at night. Cahokia's people traded across rivers that linked the continent, their networks stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. Then mysteriously, the city declined, leaving only mounds as testimony to its former power. Farther north in the Arctic, the Inuit honed survival into an art-fashioning kayaks, igloos, and harpoons, thriving in landscapes where most outsiders would freeze and starve. Along the Pacific Northwest, peoples carved totem poles taller than houses, celebrating clan lineages and myths in cedar wood, while salmon runs sustained them year after year. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, entire communities tucked under overhanging rock, with kivas, circular ceremonial chambers carved into the earth. And on the Great Plains, before horses arrived, hunters stalked bison on foot, driving herds into corrals or over cliffs, with strategy and daring. The Americas were not new worlds awaiting discovery. They were old, complex, interconnected in ways suited to their geographies. Trade networks crossed mountains and rivers. Turquoise from the southwest reached Mexico. Seashells traveled inland, hundreds of miles. Cacao moved north, obsidian south. Ideas flowed too. Myths, technologies, farming practices. Maize domesticated in Mesoamerica spread throughout the hemisphere, feeding civilizations as far apart as the Iroquois in the northeast woodlands and the Inca in the Andes. Potatoes, llamas, chocolate, chili peppers, all products of American ingenuity, would one day revolutionize global diets. Daily life, as always, was not just empire and ritual, but family farming and survival. Picture a Maya farmer planting maize in cleared jungle soil, a Pueblo woman grinding corn into flour, an Inca child tending llamas on a high plateau. Picture storytellers reciting myths under starlit skies, dancers stamping rhythms in plazas, children laughing as they chase each other between adobe walls. These moments, ephemeral and small-built civilizations as surely as pyramids and roads. What strikes us looking back is not only the diversity, but the parallels. Monumental architecture, found in pyramids, mounds, and terraces. Sophisticated calendars and astronomy charted by Maya priests and Andean skywatchers alike. Empires demanding tribute, Aztec and Inca alike mastered that art. Everywhere humans solved the puzzles of environment and society in their own ways, leaving legacies carved into stone, encoded in myth, planted in seed. And then just as these worlds reached dazzling peaks, sails appeared on the horizon. For the peoples of the Americas, the arrival of Europeans would be an apocalypse disease conquest upheaval. But that belongs to a later part of the story. For now, linger in this moment before contact the sun setting over Tenochtitlan's causeways, the wind whistling through Machu Picchu's terraces, the drums of Cahokia echoing over the Mississippi. The Americas before the sails were not empty lands, but full civilizations, vibrant and distinct. They were worlds unto themselves, about to be thrust into collision with another. But tonight in our wandering, let them stand in their own light, majestic, complicated human. Imagine the wind sweeping across the endless grasslands of Central Asia. No mountains to hem it, and no forests to muffle it, just an ocean of grass that ripples like waves under the sky. It is here in the 13th century that a storm begins to gather. Hooves drum against the earth, bows twang, and riders appear on the horizon, small at first, but multiplying until the very ground seems alive with thunder. These are the Mongols, and for one dizzying century, they will redraw the map of the world. At the heart of it all was Temujin, better known to us as Genghis Khan. Born around 1162 to a clan of herders, his early life was anything but glorious. His father was poisoned by rivals, his family abandoned by allies, and the boy, Temujin, grew up in hunger and hardship. Yet from those lean years, he learned two lessons: loyalty must be earned, and betrayal punished. By sheer charisma, cunning alliances, and ruthless force, he united the fractious Mongol tribes under his banner. In 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, he was declared Chinggis Khan, universal ruler. The steppe had found its Stormbringer. The Mongol way of war was terrifyingly effective. Their horses were small, but hardy, their bows short, but powerful, able to pierce armor at great distances. Each warrior carried multiple mounts, allowing for breathtaking speed over vast distances. Communication was swift flags. Drums and horns relayed orders across battle lines, while couriers raced along relay stations across the steppe, carrying messages faster than most enemies could march. The Mongols mastered psychological warfare. To surrender, and you might be spared. Resist, and entire cities could be razed as warnings. The combination of speed, skill, and terror created an aura of inevitability. One by one, empires and kingdoms fell. The Jin dynasty in northern China collapsed, then the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, whose ruler disastrously executed a Mongol envoy and triggered retribution on an apocalyptic scale. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, jewels of Central Asia, were overrun. Chroniclers tell of populations slaughtered, though numbers are often exaggerated. What is certain is that survivors remembered the Mongols with dread for generations. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific shores of China to the Caspian Sea, a span no conqueror had ever achieved so swiftly. But the Mongols were not finished. His descendants expanded further still. Under Ögedei, Mongol armies surged into Eastern Europe, smashing through Hungary and Poland. Under Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, the Mongols completed the conquest of China, founding the Yuan dynasty and ruling from Beijing. At its height, the Mongol Empire covered nearly a quarter of the world's landmass, from Korea to Kiev, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It was the largest contiguous empire in human history. And yet, for all the bloodshed, the Mongols also created a paradoxical peace. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Once the initial conquests were complete, the empire stabilized trade routes, secured roads, and punished banditry with merciless efficiency. For the first time, a merchant could travel the Silk Road from the Mediterranean to China under the protection of a single imperial system. Caravans grew larger, markets, busier, connections thicker. Silk spices, precious metals, and ideas flowed with a speed unseen before. Picture a caravan leaving Venice laden with glassware and woolens, crossing deserts under Mongol guards, arriving months later at bustling markets in Khanbalik, Beijing. Or imagine an emissary carrying papal letters to the Great Khan, debating religion with Buddhist monks and Nestorian Christians at a court where translators chattered in a dozen languages. The Mongol Empire was not culturally uniform, but it was astonishingly cosmopolitan. Knowledge, too, galloped across these routes. Chinese inventions like gunpowder printing and the compass spread westward more quickly under Mongol rule. Persian expertise in astronomy and medicine traveled east. Islamic scholars translated and critiqued Greek texts that would later fuel Europe's Renaissance. Even cuisine was influenced. Dumplings and noodles, for example, likely migrated with the caravans. The Mongols themselves were often curious hosts, welcoming scholars, artisans, and merchants into their courts. Kublai Khan famously entertained Marco Polo, whose tales embroidered, though they may have been fired, Europe's imagination about the riches of the East. But the empire was not free of shadows. Along with goods and ideas, less welcome travelers moved along its highways, fleas, carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused the Black Death. The very networks that allowed trade to flourish also allowed plague to spread from Central Asia into Europe, killing millions in the mid-14th century. It is a grim irony. The Mongols, who once inspired fear through conquest, may also have inadvertently unleashed one of history's deadliest pandemics. Nor could the Mongol Empire itself escape the fate of empire's division. Genghis Khan's heirs parceled it into Khanids, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. These successor states often quarreled, sometimes violently. Local cultures gradually reasserted themselves, and Mongol rulers were absorbed in China. They adopted Confucian rituals. In Persia, many embraced Islam. By the 15th century, the once unified storm had blown itself apart, leaving regional powers in its wake. Still, the Mongols had changed the world. They had reminded sedentary empires that steppe nomads were not relics of the past, but forces capable of toppling cities and rewriting history. They had stitched together continents, creating connections that would endure even after their empire fractured. They had left behind roads, postal systems, and even city foundations. In Russia, Mongol dominance shaped governance for centuries. In China, Yuan rule left architectural and cultural marks. In the Islamic world, Mongol patronage of Persian art and science bore fruit long after the Khans were gone. The Mongol story is a lesson in paradox. They were destroyers and builders, conquerors, and patrons feared barbarians and cosmopolitan rulers. Their horses churned the steppe into terror, yet their empire allowed merchants and scholars to travel more safely than ever before. They unleashed both devastation and exchange both plague and prosperity. Picture at last a Mongol rider at dawn scanning the horizon from horseback. Behind him stretches the vastness of the steppe, endless as the sky. Before him, a road leading to lands he has never seen but intends to conquer. He is one of thousands, a storm cloud of horsemen that will sweep across continents. And when the storm finally passes, the world will be altered, scarred, yes, but also more connected than ever before. The Mongol thunder fades, the Silk Roads splinter, and Europe, scarred by plague war and feudal squabbles, begins to stir in a different way. Picture the year 1400 in Florence, a city of narrow streets and bustling workshops. The bells of the Duomo toll across tiled rooftops, merchants haggle over wool and banking notes, and in a dim studio, an artist mixes pigments, muttering about perspective and proportion. Something new, or rather something reborn, is awakening. We call it the Renaissance, the rebirth, though it was less like a single dawn and more like countless lanterns being lit across Europe, flickering, competing, feeding one another's flame. The Renaissance was not simply a rediscovery of ancient Greece and Rome. It was a reimagining, a remix, a bold assertion that human beings could shape the world not only through prayer or war, but through art, science, and curiosity. After centuries of being reminded of their smallness under divine order, Europeans now dared to measure cathedrals, with geometry dissect the human body, and paint the heavens in frescoes. God was still present. Of course, cathedrals didn't exactly stop being built, but man was stepping forward, quill and compass in hand. Florence often gets the credit for kicking things off, and rightly so. Its wealth came from cloth and banking families like the Medici, turning profit into patronage. Lorenzo de' Medici, nicknamed the Magnificent, sponsored poets, painters, and philosophers, surrounding himself with a court that glittered like a living museum. In Florence's workshops, artists like Botticelli painted the birth of Venus, a goddess rising from the sea, scandalously pagan and breathtakingly beautiful. Nearby, Filippo Brunelleschi designed a dome for Florence's cathedral, so vast it seemed to defy gravity, using mathematical tricks borrowed from Roman ruins and sharpened with his own ingenuity. Perspective, the art of making flat surfaces appear three-dimensional, was one of the great Renaissance revelations. Before, medieval art had looked a little stiff, with figures floating awkwardly on golden backgrounds. Now, artists sketched vanishing points, drew grids, and suddenly their paintings opened like windows, streets receding, buildings standing in proportion, faces alive with individuality. It was as if the world itself had been redrawn, not just with color, but with depth. And Florence was only the beginning. In Milan, Leonardo da Vinci dissected corpses at night, painted masterpieces by day, and sketched flying machines and notebooks that look uncannily like blueprints for helicopters. In Rome, Michelangelo carved David from marble, a figure so lifelike you half expect him to step down from his pedestal. Raphael painted popes and Madonnas with serene clarity. Across Europe, presses clattered as Johannes Gutenberg's invention of movable type made books cheaper and knowledge harder to hoard. Imagine the thrill of a student in 1450 buying a book not as a precious manuscript copied by monks, but as a printed volume he could scribble in. The floodgates of learning opened, and Europe began to drown in a good way in ideas. Humanism lay at the heart of it all. Scholars called humanists dug into dusty libraries, dusted off Cicero, Plato, and Aristotle, and asked what their wisdom could mean for a new age. They weren't abandoning Christianity, many remained devout, but they were expanding the frame. Humans, they argued, were rational, creative, and capable of dignity. A well-rounded education, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, philosophy, was the path to shaping better citizens and wiser leaders. If the medieval world had been obsessed with salvation. The Renaissance world was increasingly interested in potential. But the Renaissance wasn't only art and scholarship. It was also about power and politics. City-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan were perpetually at each other's throats, hiring mercenary captains condottieri to fight wars that often ended with little more than dramatic parades. Venice, perched on its lagoons, grew rich, controlling trade routes, its arsenals churning out ships at an industrial pace. Banking families lent money to kings, their ledgers more decisive than swords. Machiavelli, watching these maneuvers, penned The Prince, a guidebook that advised rulers to be cunning as foxes and strong as lions, a work so brutally honest it still unnerves politicians today. And let's not forget the North. While Italian cities glowed with frescoes, the Renaissance seeped into Flanders, Germany, and England, each region adding its own flavor. In the Low Countries, Jan van Eyck mastered oil paints, layering glazes that gave portraits uncanny realism. In Germany, Albrecht Dürer carved woodcuts that looked like miniature universes of line and shadow. In England, the Renaissance found its bard, William Shakespeare, whose plays captured the tragedy and comedy of human life in words that still draw crowds 4 centuries later. If Michelangelo carved human dignity in marble, Shakespeare carved it in language. The Renaissance was not purely sunshine, of course. Wars ravaged Italy, plagues still returned, and the glittering courts were often built on the backs of peasants who remained poor and powerless. Women, though occasionally breaking through as artists or patrons, were largely excluded from the new, man-centered humanism. And for all the celebration of reason and beauty, violence and intolerance still simmered. Witness the bonfires of vanities in Florence, where fiery preacher Savonarola ordered citizens to burn their cosmetics books and artworks in the name of purity. The Renaissance was not a utopia. It was a messy, vibrant flowering, sprouting through cracks in an uneven world. Yet when viewed from afar, it marked a turning point. Europe's appetite for knowledge expanded beyond its borders. Maps grew more detailed. Sailors trained with compasses and whispers of lands across the ocean stirred curiosity. The Renaissance was both inward and outward, a rebirth of ancient wisdom, and a restless push toward horizons unseen. Soon, caravels would leave Iberian harbors, carrying explorers, merchants, and conquerors into the Atlantic, unleashing encounters that would transform the globe. But before we sail, linger for a moment in a Renaissance workshop. The smell of oil paint and sawdust hangs in the air. An apprentice grinds pigments. A master sketches a patron's portrait. A mathematician leans over a slate tracing proportions. Outside, bells ring. Merchants shout. Children chase each other through the alleys. The world is still medieval in many ways, yet also undeniably new. Ideas are spilling faster than they can be contained. The horizon is stretching wider, with every brushstroke, every printed page, every whispered debate in candlelit halls. This, then, is the Renaissance horizon, not a neat rebirth, but a restless dawn, a reminder that humans given inkstone and curiosity will always try to redraw the world, sometimes beautifully, sometimes dangerously, but never indifferently. Step out of the candlelit workshops of Renaissance Florence and Venice and follow the sound of waves breaking on a rocky shore. The late 15th century was an age when Europe, restless and ambitious, turned its gaze from frescoes on chapel ceilings to the uncharted waters beyond the horizon. Imagine standing on a Portuguese dock at dawn, the salt spray sharp in your nose, sailors loading barrels of wine and salted fish onto a ship, a priest blessing the voyage, and a crowd squinting at the strange new vessel tied to the pier. This was the age of the caravel, a ship that paired with compass and astrolabe would pry open the oceans and stitch the continents into one restless web. Europe had long desired the luxuries of Asia, spices, silk, precious metals, But the old land routes were now costly and contested. The Ottoman Turks had seized Constantinople in 1453, cutting off easy access to the east. Merchants in Venice and Genoa could still bring goods through Mediterranean routes, but Iberian kingdoms, Portugal and Spain, sought a different way. Why pay middlemen when you could sail directly to the source? Portugal took the lead. Under Prince Henry, the navigator-explorers crept down the coast of Africa, establishing trading posts at Ceuta Elmina and farther south. They sought gold, ivory, and pepper, but also mapped winds and currents, slowly piecing together an oceanic highway. By the time Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, the Portuguese had cracked the code of the Atlantic. Imagine the astonishment in Calicut as these pale foreigners stepped ashore after months at sea, bearing trinkets laughably crude compared to India's fine goods, yet carrying cannons that spoke a universal language. Spain, watching jealously, gambled on a different path. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail westward, hoping to reach Asia by crossing the Atlantic. Instead, he stumbled upon islands in the Caribbean, setting in motion one of the most consequential encounters in history. To Europeans, it was a new world. To the millions already living there, it was the beginning of upheaval. Still in that moment, no one could see the full weight of the change. Columbus believed he had reached Asia. His crews saw fertile islands, rivers gleaming with possibility, and people unlike any they had met before. Soon, Spanish conquistadors, Cortés in Mexico, Pizarro in Peru, toppled empires with a mix of steel horses, alliances, and pathogens. The Aztec and Inca worlds, which had flourished for centuries, collapsed in decades. The shock was so immense, it is hard to overstate cities. Burned gods, dethroned millions dead, from smallpox before a single battle was fought. Yet alongside conquest came something else, an exchange that reshaped the planet. Historians call it the Columbian Exchange, but you might think of it as the most chaotic global recipe swap in history. Crops, animals, and diseases crossed oceans in both directions, transforming diets, economies, and ecologies. From the Americas came maize potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, cacao, and tobacco. Imagine the first Italian who bit into a tomato, now the star of pasta sauces and pizza, or the Irish farmer planting potatoes that would one day feed millions. Chocolate sweetened Europe's palate chilies, spiced up Asia's cuisine, and maize became a staple in Africa. From Europe, Africa, and Asia came wheat rice, sugarcane horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep. The sight of a horse galloping on the Great Plains, a creature unknown in the Americas before 1492, must have seemed like a thunder god had descended. But the exchange was not all abundance and flavor. Along with animals and grains came diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, that ravaged indigenous populations in the Americas. Mortality rates soared, wiping out 50 to 90% of communities within a century. Meanwhile, Europeans relatively immune after centuries of exposure survived and expanded. The balance of power tilted sharply, and with it, history's trajectory. Another grim legacy of this oceanic opening was the Atlantic slave trade. European plantations in the Americas demanded labor to grow sugar tobacco and cotton crops that made fortunes in Lisbon, Seville, and London. Indigenous populations decimated by disease could not supply the workforce, and so ships carried millions of Africans across the Atlantic in chains. The Middle Passage was a nightmare of cramped holds, disease, and brutality. Those who survived were forced into lifetimes of labor in foreign lands. This was globalization's darker engine, wealth built on suffering economies powered by enslavement. Yet amid these tragedies, the oceans also became highways of connection. Imagine a Manila galleon sailing from the Philippines to Mexico, its holds packed with Chinese silk, Indian spices, and American silver. Silver mined in Potosi. Bolivia flowed to Spain, then to China, fueling trade and empire. The world economy for the first time truly circled the globe. You could trace a line from an African village to a Brazilian sugar plantation, from a Spanish mine to a Chinese market stall, from a Portuguese spice port in Goa to a London coffee house where merchants traded shares. Culturally, the encounters sparked both violence and creativity. Missionaries carried Christianity to the Americas, often destroying indigenous temples, but also blending faiths into new syncretic forms. Music, too, crossed oceans' African rhythms, mixed with European instruments and native traditions, to create entirely new genres, from samba to spirituals. Even language reflected the crossings. Words like cacao canoe and hurricane slipped into European tongues. The age of oceanic expansion also birthed a new kind of map-making. Cartographers, armed with reports from sailors, drew coastlines with increasing accuracy. Sea monsters still lurked on the margins of some maps, but gradually the unknown shrank. Globes spun in scholars' studies, reminding Europeans that their world was now a sphere filled with possibilities and dangers. And in all this, the humble compass was a silent hero. Imported from China, refined in Europe, it let sailors steer with confidence even when clouds hid the stars. The caravel, with its nimble lateen sails and sturdy hulls, could tack against the wind and survive long voyages. These innovations didn't make the oceans less dangerous. Storms still swallowed fleets, scurvy still gnawed at sailors' teeth, but they tilted the odds enough that ambition could outrun fear. By 1600, the world was recognizably global. Sugar-sweetened tea in London, brewed from Chinese leaves, stirred with silver spoons mined in Peru. African slaves harvested tobacco in Virginia, which Europeans puffed in cafes while debating philosophy. Potatoes grew in Russia, chilies burned in Indian curries, and horses thundered across the pampas of Argentina. The oceans were no longer barriers. They were bridges. Picture the docks of Seville. At dusk, ships unloading sacks of cacao, and barrels of sugar merchants scribbling figures in ledgers, beggars shouting for scraps. Beyond the horizon lay lands reshaped by contact, often in suffering, sometimes in synthesis. This was the Columbian Exchange, not a neat swap, but a turbulent mixing bowl, stirring together foods, animals, ideas, and plagues. The oceans had opened, and humanity had stepped through. The world would never again be the same. Stand in a quiet study in the late 16th century. The candle sputters, casting shadows across parchment, covered in ink blotches and sketches of circles, triangles, and strange planetary orbits. Outside, the church bells mark another ordinary evening in a deeply religious Europe. But inside, someone is daring to imagine that Earth might not be the center of everything. This, friends, was the start of a storm, not of swords or sails, but of ideas. The scientific revolution was less a single aha moment and more like a thunderstorm rolling across Europe, strike by strike. Copernicus, a cautious Polish cleric, published On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres in 1543, proposing that the Earth revolved around the Sun. It was a modest book, buried with technicalities, but it carried dynamite within its pages. To suggest that Earth was not the universe's anchor, but a mere planet in orbit, it was like telling people the stage they stood on was actually moving beneath them. The storm spread. Galileo Galilei, armed with a telescope improved from a Dutch invention, pointed it skyward and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, not Earth. He sketched sunspots, craters on the moon, and even the Milky Way's countless stars. And yet it moves, he supposedly muttered after being forced to recant before church authorities. Johannes Kepler calculated planetary orbits as ellipses rather than perfect circles, while Isaac Newton, in the late 17th century, pulled it all together. Sitting under an apple tree, at least in legend, He linked the fall of a fruit to the movement of the planets, articulating the law of universal gravitation. The heavens and the earth were bound by the same rules, elegant and mathematical. It was a profound shift. For millennia, people explained the cosmos with myth and faith. Now, increasingly, they reached for observation, experiment, and reason. The scientific revolution didn't abandon God. Many of its thinkers were devout, but it reframed creation as a system that could be measured, tested, and understood. Nature was no longer a mystery to endure. It was a puzzle to solve. This spirit of inquiry seeped into other realms. Anatomy advanced when Vesalius dissected human bodies, mapping muscles and organs with unprecedented precision. William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood, watching the heart as a pump rather than a mystical furnace. Chemistry crept out of alchemy's smoky chambers, inching toward the periodic table. Even microscopes opened new worlds. Antony von Leeuwenhoek peered into a droplet of water and saw animal cules, tiny life forms no one had known existed. Humanity's sense of scale shattered. The universe was bigger. The body, more intricate life, more complex than anyone had guessed. And yet knowledge alone was not the revolution's greatest shockwave. The deeper quake was epistemological. How do we know what we know? Francis Bacon urged the use of inductive reasoning, building knowledge from observation and experiment, while René Descartes pursued doubt until he landed on his famous "I think, therefore I am." Between them, a new method took root, the scientific method. Test, measure, repeat, verify. It sounds simple to us now, but in the 1600s, it was radical enough to threaten centuries-old authorities. By the 18th century, these storms of reason had spilled into philosophy, politics, and society in what we call the Enlightenment. Imagine a Paris salon candles flickering over glasses of wine as writers and thinkers debate Montesquieu, arguing for separation of powers, Voltaire mocking intolerance with razor wit, Rousseau insisting that sovereignty belongs to the people, not kings. Across the Channel, John Locke declared that humans had natural rights, life, liberty, property, that governments must protect. Across the Atlantic, Benjamin Franklin flew a kite in a thunderstorm, discovering electricity with one hand while sipping philosophy with the other. The Enlightenment thrived not only in books, but in conversation. Salons in Paris, coffee houses in London, lecture halls in Edinburgh, these were its temples. Ideas spread faster thanks to the printing press, newspapers, and pamphlets. A merchant could read about astronomy over breakfast. A tailor could debate natural rights over ale. Knowledge was democratizing unsettling hierarchies that had long seemed eternal. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Monarchs eyed these ideas warily, though some so-called enlightened despots like Frederick the Great of Prussia or Catherine the Great of Russia tried to harness reason without relinquishing power. The Catholic Church bristled at challenges to doctrine, and yet the tide was hard to stop. Once people tasted the idea that authority should be tested, not obeyed blindly, the world tilted. Science and enlightenment didn't just live in laboratories and salons. They reshaped everyday life. Navigation improved with better charts and chronometers, fueling global trade. Agricultural innovations, the seed drill crop rotation experiments fed growing populations. Vaccination, pioneered by Edward Jenner against smallpox, offered protection against humanity's oldest scourge. Even leisure shifted. Encyclopedias summarized human knowledge. Music by Bach and Mozart explored harmony with mathematical beauty, and novels invited readers into fictional lives, sparking empathy across class and gender divides. Yet reason's storms carried contradictions. Enlightenment thinkers preached liberty and equality, but many ignored or even justified slavery and colonial exploitation. Newton calculated the cosmos, while investors funded voyages to seize land and people. The age celebrated rational debate, but women like Mary Wollstonecraft had to fight for their voices to be heard. The universal rights proclaimed were often applied selectively. Enlightenment was real dazzling, but incomplete. Still, the consequences were seismic. These ideas inspired revolutions, the American colonies declaring independence in 1776, with Lockean principles, the French storming the Bastille in 1789, with Rousseau's cries of sovereignty, and countless others reshaping governments in the decades ahead. Science and philosophy had not just explained the world, they had armed people to change it. Picture the close of a long Enlightenment evening, a salon emptying as carriages clatter away pamphlets scattered on a table, a half-drunk bottle of wine glinting in the candle's last light. Outside, the city hums merchants, laborers, servants, soldiers. They may not yet grasp it, but the ideas seated in those rooms, those books, those telescopes will ripple outward, unsettling monarchies, empowering revolutions, reshaping how humans see themselves in the universe. Reason's storms did not clear all clouds, but they lit the sky with flashes of possibility, proving that knowledge could be pursued, shared, and wielded not just for survival, but for transformation. The world was no longer centered on an immobile earth, nor locked in unquestioned hierarchies. It was a stage of inquiry, argument, and restless creativity, and the play had only just begun. The Enlightenment's candlelight salons may have sparked revolutions in thought, but outside those book-lined rooms, the roar of cannons was already rewriting the world's balance of power. From Istanbul's domes to Delhi's palaces, from the Bosporus to Bengal, a new breed of empires rose on the back of a potent invention, gunpowder. Where once chariots and cavalry had dominated, now muskets cracked, cannons thundered, and states learned to centralize not just philosophy, but firepower. Take the Ottomans. In 1453, long before Voltaire picked up his pen, Sultan Mehmed II stood outside the walls of Constantinople with the boom of cannons at his side. The city defended for 1,000 years by walls so thick they had shrugged off countless sieges, fell after weeks of bombardment by guns so massive they had to be hauled by hundreds of oxen. The Hagia Sophia, once the jewel of Byzantine Christianity, became a mosque, and Istanbul was born. From that moment, the Ottomans were more than a regional power. They were a superpower straddling Europe and Asia, commanding trade routes, cultures, and armies alike. Under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, the empire stretched from Hungary's plains to Arabia's deserts. Picture Istanbul. At its height, domes and minarets piercing the skyline, the Bosporus churning with ships carrying grain silks and spices, and markets alive with merchants from 3 continents. Yet behind the splendor stood disciplined janissaries, an elite corps originally composed of Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. Armed with muskets drilled in formation, they became the backbone of Ottoman might. To the east, another empire rose under the Safavids in Persia. Their founder, Shah Ismail, carved a realm that blended Persian tradition with Shia Islam, setting it apart religiously from its Sunni Ottoman rivals. Safavid art dazzled with tilework and miniature paintings. Their capital, Isfahan, was hailed as half the world for its beauty. But just as important were their musketeers and artillery, which allowed them to stand toe-to-toe with their powerful neighbors. The Safavid dynasty created a Persian identity strong enough to survive conquest, leaving echoes in modern Iran. And in South Asia, the Mughals built perhaps the most glittering of all gunpowder empires. Babur, a descendant of Timur, and Genghis Khan, swept down from Central Asia in the early 16th century. his cannon-shocking Indian battlefields, accustomed to elephants and cavalry. His descendants turned conquest into statecraft. Under Akbar the Great, the Mughal Empire stretched across most of India, ruling over tens of millions, with a blend of tolerance and bureaucracy. Imagine Akbar at court, turbaned scholars from many faiths debating before him, while clerks tally taxes in Persian script and artists illustrate manuscripts with exquisite detail. The Mughals left behind not only a legacy of governance, but of architecture that still stuns. The Red Fort in Delhi, Fatehpur Sikri's palaces, and above all the Taj Mahal, commissioned by Shah Jahan as a tomb for his beloved wife, stand as reminders that empires wielded not only cannons, but chisels. Mughal rule, however, was not purely golden. Heavy taxation strained peasants, and by the 18th century internal divisions and the rise of new rivals, including Europeans, eroded their supremacy. Meanwhile, in East Asia, China's Ming dynasty had already shown the world the grandeur of centralized states. In the early 1400s, Admiral Zheng, his vast treasure fleets, ships dwarfing anything in Europe, sailed to Southeast Asia, India, and East Africa, displaying Chinese power. Yet soon after, the Ming rulers turned inward, dismantling those fleets and focusing on domestic order. Their walls grew taller. The Great Wall we picture today was largely a Ming creation, while their bureaucracy ballooned with Confucian examinations. Gunpowder weapons were integrated but cautiously, as the empire's size and wealth made it feel secure. That security proved fragile when the Manchus seized power in 1644, founding the Qing dynasty. The Qing would expand China's borders to their greatest extent, ruling Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan. With banner armies that combined cavalry and firearms, they held their realm together, even as European ships began pressing on China's coasts. Inside the Forbidden City, emperors ruled with ritual splendor, while outside Jesuit missionaries introduced Western astronomy and art. The Qing, like other gunpowder states, blended tradition with adaptation, sometimes successfully, sometimes stubbornly. While Asia's empires roared with cannon fire, Europe was not idle. Small kingdoms armed with their own muskets and artillery began building overseas empires. Portugal and Spain had been first planting flags in Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines. But by the 17th century, new rivals, England, France, and the Dutch Republic, joined the fray. Their navies bristling with cannon-projected power across oceans. Wars in Europe, like the 30 Years' War, were fought with gunpowder, but their colonial ambitions extended battles to the Caribbean, India, and beyond. Sugar islands, spice ports, and coastal forts became pawns in a game of imperial chess. This was the paradox of the Gunpowder Age empires, centralized at home even as they sprawled abroad. The Ottoman Sultan ruled over diverse peoples through millet systems that allowed religious communities some autonomy. The Mughals balanced Hindu and Muslim subjects with pragmatic tolerance. The Qing claimed to be Confucian emperors while ruling non-Han peoples with other traditions. In Europe, monarchs like Louis XIV of France gathered power into their own hands, declaring "I am the state" while sending fleets across the Atlantic. Everywhere, rulers leaned on the same logic: guns made kings strong, but guns also demanded wealth, bureaucracy, and constant vigilance. Daily life under these empires was shaped as much by the plow as by the musket. Farmers in Anatolia still rose with the sun, Mughal weavers still bent over looms, and Qing peasants still planted rice in paddies. But taxes funded cannons, and trade in textiles, spices, and silver fueled empire's ambitions. A bolt of Indian cotton might clothe a Dutch merchant, an Ottoman cannon might guard a caravan, and a Qing porcelain vase might sit in a Paris drawing room. Gunpowder states were not isolated fortresses. They were nodes in a global system that was tightening with every decade. And while these empires looked invincible in the 16th and 17th centuries, Their rivalries contained seeds of change. The Ottomans and Safavids clashed endlessly along their borders. The Mughals faced rising Maratha powers and European encroachment. The Qing struggled with population growth and fiscal strain. Europe's states, though smaller, proved agile, their naval empires feeding them wealth and colonies. The age of gunpowder states was glorious, but precarious, powerful, but restless. Picture at last a battlefield in the 17th century. Drums pound smoke billows. Musketeers fire in volleys. Cannons roar from wooden fortifications. A sultan's banner flaps in the wind. Across the field, an enemy standard glitters. The clash is deafening, the outcome uncertain. Yet the sound of this battle, the musket crack, the cannon boom, echoes far beyond. It is the soundtrack of a world being reshaped, of empires rising and colliding, of states learning that to survive in this age, one needed not only vision and bureaucracy, but also fire and powder. Imagine the dawn of a new century in Europe around 1750. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth, as it has for centuries. Villages wake slowly, roosters, crow mill wheels creak. Life is familiar, tied to sun and season. And then within a few generations, the air itself changes. Smoke thickens, iron clangs, pistons hiss. The world begins to hum with machines. This was the Industrial Revolution, not just a new chapter in history, but a turning of the page so radical that some say it divided everything before from everything after. The revolution did not begin with a single invention, though James Watt's improved steam engine is often its poster child. Instead, it was a cascade. Coal, long used for heating, now fueled furnaces and engines. Iron, once laboriously smelted in small batches, was produced in massive quantities with new techniques. Textiles spun faster thanks to machines like the spinning jenny and the power loom. Steam drove pumps, then trains, then ships. Each advance unlocked another until the old rhythms of field and workshop could no longer keep up. Picture a textile mill in Manchester in the early 1800s. Rows of machines clatter so loudly, workers must shout to be heard. Cotton threads whip through looms, powered by belts and shafts turning from a steam engine in the basement. Children dart between machines to tie threads, their small hands prized by overseers. Outside, smoke pours from chimneys darkening the sky. The city is crowded, noisy, alive, with both opportunity and misery. This is the industrial city, wealth and squalor, bound together by soot. Britain led the charge, blessed or cursed with coal deposits, navigable rivers, and a restless merchant class. Its colonial empire fed it cotton, sugar, and markets. But soon, the revolution spread to France, Belgium, Germany, the United States, and beyond. By the late 19th century, Japan too had industrialized, joining the club of smoke-belching steel-forging powers. The world was no longer a patchwork of agricultural kingdoms and empires. It was becoming a web of industrial economies. The transformation touched every life. Farmers left fields for factories swelling cities. Traditional crafts shrank as mass production cheapened goods. Railroads crisscrossed landscapes, shrinking time and distance. Imagine boarding a train in 1850, watching fields blur past at 30 miles an hour, a speed so novel some feared it might damage the human body. Telegraph lines accompanied the rails, tapping messages across continents in minutes. The world, once vast, suddenly felt smaller, faster, more connected. But the revolution was not simply about gadgets. It reshaped society. A new class emerged, the industrial working class. They lived in crowded tenements, worked long hours, and endured dangerous conditions. Diseases spread quickly in filthy cities. Yet alongside them rose another class, the bourgeoisie, owners and entrepreneurs who reaped fortunes from factories and trade. Karl Marx watching these shifts, declared that history itself was being rewritten by the clash between workers and owners. His Communist Manifesto of 1848 thundered that workers of the world must unite against exploitation. Whether one agreed or not, his words captured the upheaval of the age. Children of the Enlightenment had dreamed of liberty and equality. Children of the Industrial Revolution often dreamed simply of rest. Yet they organized, forming unions, striking for better wages, demanding shorter hours. Slowly, painfully, laws changed. Safety standards crept into factories, child labor restrictions appeared, and education expanded. Progress was uneven, but it was real. The revolution also altered gender roles. Middle-class women, freed from some labor by servants, or new domestic goods, were pushed into ideals of domesticity, angels of the house. But working-class women often labored in factories, earning meager wages. In both cases, the upheaval planted seeds of change. By the late 19th century, women's suffrage movements gathered steam, arguing that a modern industrial society could not silence half its population. And then there was the environment. Coal smoke blackened cities, rivers turned toxic with dyes, and waste forests shrank to feed furnaces. For the first time, humans reshaped landscapes, not just locally, but globally. The Industrial Revolution was the opening act of what we now call the Anthropocene, the age when human activity alters the planet itself. Still, amid the grime and struggle, wonders abounded. The Crystal Palace in London, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, gleamed with glass and iron housing inventions from across the world. Visitors marveled at steam engines, printing presses, and telegraphs as if humanity had cracked open a chest of Promethean fire. To a farmer from the countryside, it must have seemed like stepping into a dream of the future, terrifying, exhilarating, unstoppable. And industrialization was not confined to Europe. In the United States, factories multiplied along New England rivers, while railroads bound the vast continent, driving westward expansion. In Russia, czars pushed railways across Siberia, even as peasants still toiled under semi-feudal conditions. In Japan, the Meiji Restoration of 1868 catapulted the nation into rapid industrialization, blending tradition with steel and steam. Everywhere, leaders saw that industrial power meant military power. Those who lagged risked subjugation. Indeed, the Industrial Revolution was as much about empire as industry. Cotton mills in Manchester depended on cotton from plantations in the American South. Cotton grown by enslaved people until abolition, and then by sharecroppers. Rubber from the Congo, tea from India, wheat from the prairies, global supply chains fed the machines of Europe and America. Colonies were not just trophies. They were raw material pipelines fueling factories and feeding workers. The human cost was staggering. Millions of Africans were uprooted through the slave trade to feed industrial economies. Colonized peoples labored under harsh regimes, their lands reshaped to serve distant masters. The wealth of industrial nations often rested on the exploitation of those who never saw a factory floor. And yet, ironically, industrial goods, cloth, tools, guns circulated back to those same colonies, transforming their societies in turn. If you stood in London around 1850, you could smell the revolution in the air literally. Coal smoke clung to clothes and lungs. The Thames stank of waste and factories lined the horizon. But you could also see it iron bridges spanning rivers, locomotives steaming out of stations, gas lights flickering along streets. The old world of candlelight and oxen had not vanished entirely, but it was being swallowed by engines and smoke. What made the Industrial Revolution different from all that came before was its compounding speed. Once set in motion, it fed on itself. Innovation spurred more innovation. Wealth funded more machines. Populations grew, and demand surged. Within a century, the world had been utterly reshaped, for better and for worse. Picture, finally, a worker leaving a textile mill at dusk, soot on his face, tired, but carrying a few coins in his pocket. He walks past a printing shop, selling cheap newspapers, a train station where steam engines roar, and a shop window filled with porcelain from China. His life is harder, noisier, and dirtier than his grandfather's, but also more connected, more dynamic, more modern. He may not know it, but he is living in a hinge of history, the industrial turn, when engines and smoke rewrote what it meant to be human in the world. By the mid-19th century, the smoke of the Industrial Revolution had not only reshaped cities and skies, but also stoked an insatiable appetite. Factories demanded cotton rubber copper and palm oil. Steamships needed coaling stations on long voyages. European investors wanted new markets for the avalanche of manufactured goods pouring off assembly lines. And so the gaze of Europe turned with renewed intensity toward Africa, a continent long connected through trade, but now eyed as a canvas for empire. What followed was one of the most dramatic and ruthless scrambles in history. Africa was no blank slate, though European explorers often pretended otherwise. For centuries, kingdoms like Benin, Ashanti, Ethiopia, and Zulu had ruled vast territories. Trade routes threaded the Sahara, linking West Africa to the Mediterranean. East African ports thrived on the Indian Ocean's monsoon winds, exchanging ivory and gold for cloth and spices. The continent was a mosaic of polities, large and small, centralized and loose, each with its own traditions, hierarchies, and rivalries. But to European powers, flushed with industrial confidence, Africa was a prize waiting to be claimed. The spark was exploration. Men like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley trekked through rivers and jungles, their accounts thrilling European readers, hungry for tales of adventure. Newspapers breathlessly described waterfalls, mountains, and unknown tribes as though Africa had just appeared on the map. In reality, African societies knew their lands well. It was Europe that was catching up. Still, these expeditions laid the groundwork for something far less romantic than discovery-conquest. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 was the turning point. European powers, fearing conflict with each other more than with Africans, gathered in Berlin to divide the continent like slices of cake. No Africans were invited to the table. With maps spread across tables and rulers drawing lines with casual precision, they parceled out territories. Britain eyeing a corridor from Cairo to Cape Town, France, sweeping across West Africa, Belgium, claiming the Congo, Germany, and Italy snatching corners. The rules were simple. Plant your flag, build an outpost, and it was yours at least on paper. On the ground, the scramble for Africa was brutal. Conquest often meant machine guns against spears. The Maxim gun, invented in the 1880s, allowed small European forces to mow down vastly larger African armies. Resistance was fierce Zulu warriors, modest fighters in Sudan, and Samurai Touré's forces in West Africa all fought valiantly. But the technological gap was punishing. Campaign after campaign ended with Africans facing not just superior weapons, but also the devastating effects of disease, famine, and disrupted economies. The Congo Free State, claimed personally by King Leopold II of Belgium, became the darkest example of exploitation. Under the guise of civilizing missions, Leopold's agents forced communities into brutal labor systems to harvest rubber. Villages that failed quotas faced punishment so horrific they still haunt history books, hand-severed families torn apart. Millions died in what some historians call one of the first genocides of the modern age. When the scandal finally broke in Europe, it shocked the public. though not enough to undo the devastation. Elsewhere, imperial rule varied, but carried similar patterns. Taxation forced labor railways built to extract resources, and borders drawn without regard for ethnic or cultural landscapes. A single line on a European map might split one people in two, or throw rival groups together in a new colony. These artificial divisions would leave legacies of tension that outlasted colonialism itself. And yet the story was not only one of victimhood. African resistance, though often crushed, never ceased. The Ethiopians under Emperor Menelik II defeated Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, securing their independence and sending shockwaves through Europe. In South Africa, the Zulu kingdom under Shaka and later leaders resisted encroachment for decades, while the Boer Wars revealed that even settlers could clash violently with imperial ambitions. Resistance took quieter forms. Two communities, fleeing into forests, people withholding labor, oral traditions, mocking colonial rule. Daily life under empire was a patchwork of adaptation and struggle. Railroads and telegraphs did link some regions, but mostly to ports for resource export. Schools and missions introduced literacy, but often only in European languages and only for limited purposes. Cash economies disrupted subsistence farming, forcing people to work on plantations or mines. Yet African cultures endured reshaping themselves in the crucible of empire. Music, religion, and art blended old and new, creating traditions that would later fuel movements of identity and independence. The scramble also had global ripples. European rivalries in Africa fed into broader imperial competitions. Britain boasted of ruling a quarter of the globe, the empire on which the sun never sets. France sought prestige in its sprawling West African domains. Germany, a new nation, eager for recognition, scrambled to catch up. Italy's attempts often ended in embarrassment, especially at Adwa. The competition was not just about Africa, but about the balance of power in Europe itself. Colonies were trophies in a larger contest of national pride. Meanwhile, the consequences of empire flowed outward. African resources fed European industry, Congolese rubber for bicycle tires, West African cocoa for chocolate, South African gold for banking reserves. African soldiers were conscripted into European armies, fighting in wars far from home. And in the bustling metropoles of Paris, London, and Berlin, colonial exhibitions displayed African people as curiosities, reflecting the era's toxic mix of fascination and racism. By 1900, nearly all of Africa was under European rule, except Ethiopia and Liberia. The map had been remade in a frenzy of ambition, greed, and arrogance. Empires stretched thin across a continent they barely understood, ruling through a mixture of violence, alliances, and bureaucracy. It looked permanent, but beneath the surface, discontent smoldered. Picture for a moment a railway being laid in the Congo. African laborers swing hammers under the whip of overseers, the jungle pressing in on all sides. Each rail ties the colony more tightly to distant markets, yet each swing of the hammer also deepens resentment. Now picture an Ethiopian warrior at Adwa lifting a shield against Italian gunfire and refusing to yield. These images, one of subjugation, one of defiance, capture the paradox of Africa under partition. The industrial empires thought they had secured Africa forever, but the very forces they unleashed, railways, schools, political movements, would one day turn against them. The scramble had been fast, the conquest often brutal, but empire is always more fragile than it appears. The cracks were already forming, even if Europe could not yet see them. The soot of the Industrial Revolution still clung to the brick walls of factories when the guns of modern war roared to life. The very engines and innovations that had promised progress now armed humanity with the tools of destruction on a scale never seen before. In the early 20th century, the world plunged into not one, but two wars so vast that they scarred not just nations, but the very psyche of civilization. Let's begin in 1914. Europe seemed on the surface to hum with prosperity. Cities buzzed with trams, cafes overflowed with chatter, and telegraphs clicked with the confidence of a modern age. Beneath the polish, though, alliances nodded like tripwires. Empires jostled for colonies. Armies swelled with conscripts, and industrial power churned out rifles, artillery, and dreadnoughts. When a young Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the tripwire snapped. Within weeks, Europe's great powers, bound by treaties and suspicion, stumbled into the First World War. Imagine the Western Front. Trenches zigzagging across France and Belgium, muddy scars filled with soldiers who lived, slept, and often died in the muck. The air reeked of cordite and rot, the nights filled with the whine of shells and the scurrying of rats. Machine guns scythed down charges in seconds, barbed wire snarled men like flies in a web, and poison gas rolled like a greenish mist, burning lungs and eyes. For 4 long years, the front barely moved, while millions perished for a few yards of soil. It was not only Europe. From Ottoman deserts to African colonies, the war spread like a contagion. Indian, Senegalese, and Australian troops fought far from home. In 1917, the United States, once determined to stay neutral, entered the conflict, tipping the balance. By 1918, Germany, exhausted and starved by blockade, collapsed into revolution. The armistice was signed. The guns fell silent, but the silence felt haunted. An entire generation had been decimated. Villages across Europe bore gaps where young men should have stood. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 promised peace, but planted new poisons. Germany was saddled with reparations. Its pride shattered, its democracy fragile. Empires cracked. Austria-Hungary dissolved the Ottoman domains, carved into mandates. Russia convulsed into revolution. Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, pulling Russia from the war, but inaugurating a communist experiment that terrified and fascinated the world. The map was redrawn, but the ink barely dried before it began to smudge again. The 1920s offered a brief illusion of normalcy. Jazz spilled from clubs, radios crackled, and automobiles coughed down streets. Yet beneath the glitz of the roaring 20s lay fragile foundations. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, economies collapsed, unemployment soared, and faith in liberal democracy wavered. People sought order and hope in new, dangerous voices. In Italy, Mussolini paraded black-shirted followers, promising a return to Roman glory. In Germany, Adolf Hitler raged about betrayal, scapegoating Jews and minorities, and promising to restore power through a ruthless ideology. In Japan, militarists looked to expand across Asia. Totalitarian regimes rose, feeding on despair and nationalism, their rhetoric amplified by radio and propaganda films. The seeds of another, even deadlier conflict sprouted in the soil of crisis. By 1939, those seeds bore their poisoned fruit. Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. This time, the fighting was faster, deadlier, more global. German tanks rolled in blitzkrieg lightning war, smashing through defenses with terrifying speed. Planes screamed overhead, dropping bombs on cities, blurring the line between battlefield and home front. The war was not confined to Europe. Japan, already in China since the 1930s, expanded across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Pearl Harbor, in 1941, dragged the United States fully into the conflict, transforming it into a truly global struggle. Battles raged from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, from Stalingrad's frozen ruins to the beaches of Normandy. And then there was the Holocaust. In ghettos and camps across Europe, Nazi Germany carried out the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, alongside Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others. Industrialized genocide railways, gas chambers, ledgers turned bureaucracy into horror. Civilization's darkest hour unfolded not on a battlefield, but in camps hidden behind barbed wire and euphemisms. The world, when it finally confronted the truth, reeled in grief and shame. By 1945, the Axis powers lay in ruins. Hitler dead in his bunker. Mussolini executed Japan, bombed into surrender after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The mushroom cloud, a new symbol of human ingenuity, twisted into terror, marked the dawn of the nuclear age. World War II killed an estimated 70 million people, soldiers and civilians alike. Cities like Warsaw, Dresden, and Tokyo were flattened. Entire continents bore the scars, and yet amid devastation, the seeds of new orders were sown. The United Nations was founded in 1945, a global attempt to prevent another cataclysm. Colonial empires stretched and weakened began to unravel as independence movements surged across Asia and Africa. The United States and the Soviet Union, once reluctant allies, now glared at each other across an iron curtain. The Cold War was born even before the rubble cooled. If you stand at the midpoint of the 20th century, the contrast is dizzying. On one side, destruction so vast, it feels incomprehensible. Trenches filled with mud and blood cities, lit by firestorms, skies split by nuclear light. On the other, leaps in technology, medicine, and global governance, born of necessity and desperation. Airplanes that had once been novelties became everyday transport. Penicillin saved countless lives. The world was smaller, deadlier, and paradoxically more interconnected than ever. What did these two world wars mean for ordinary people? For a French peasant watching sons march off to trenches never to return? For a Jewish family hiding in an attic? For a Japanese farmer watching the sky turn white with atomic fire? For a Ghanaian soldier fighting in Burma? Or an Indian nurse tending the wounded in North Africa? It meant that global was no longer an abstraction. Every corner of the earth felt the ripples. Every community carried scars. The wars also left questions that still echo. How can nations balance power without courting destruction? How do we remember horror without being paralyzed by it? Can technology, once uncorked, ever be controlled? Humanity had proven capable of organizing on a planetary scale, first for destruction, then for fragile peace. Picture, finally, a war cemetery in the quiet of evening. Rows of white stones stretch to the horizon, names carved in silence. Birds wheel overhead. Children play in nearby fields. Life resumes. Yet beneath the grass lies the memory of a century when the world went to war, not once, but twice wars, that ended empires, birthed new ones, and left us staring at the sky, wondering whether our brilliance would save us or destroy us. The guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, but the quiet was uneasy. From the ruins of Berlin to the ashes of Hiroshima, the world looked around and realized that the old order empire's monarchies and centuries-old dominance had collapsed. In its place, two new giants towered: the United States and the Soviet Union. One championed capitalism and liberal democracy, the other communism and central planning. Their rivalry would shape the second half of the 20th century, not through open global war, but through something stranger, a Cold War, simmering everywhere, boiling over in flashes, but never quite spilling into the cataclysm of nuclear annihilation. Picture the late 1940s. Winston Churchill, surveying Europe's new reality, warned of an iron curtain stretching from the Baltic to the Adriatic, dividing east and west. On one side, NATO formed under American leadership. On the other, the Warsaw Pact under Moscow's watch. Germany itself split into two states. Berlin divided by checkpoints and eventually by a wall. The Cold War was not just geography, it was ideology, economics, and paranoia. And hovering over it all, the bomb. The mushroom clouds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not the end, but the beginning of nuclear anxiety. The US and USSR stockpiled warheads by the thousands missiles capable of annihilating cities in minutes. School children practiced duck-and-cover drills while military planners sketched scenarios of mutually assured destruction. For the first time in history, humanity had the ability to erase itself entirely, and everyone knew it. Yet for all the terror, the Cold War also fueled extraordinary bursts of creativity. The space race turned rockets of war into vessels of wonder. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a beeping metal sphere that circled Earth and sent Americans into a panic. By 1969, Neil Armstrong planted a flag on the moon, declaring one giant leap for mankind. The Cold War played out in orbit, as much as on Earth, inspiring generations of children to dream of stars while their parents worried about missiles. Back on the ground, decolonization reshaped the map. The old European empires weakened and morally discredited found their colonies demanding freedom. India broke from Britain in 1947, its independence a joyous moment shadowed by partition and communal violence. Across Africa, nations like Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria threw off colonial rule in the 1950s and 1960s, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through bitter wars. The winds of change, as one British Prime Minister put it, blew hard across the globe. Yet independence was not easy. Borders drawn in European boardrooms often lumped rival groups together or split communities apart, sowing conflicts that lingered. The Cold War rivalry extended into these new nations, each side eager to court allies. Aid, weapons, and ideology flowed into Africa, Asia, and Latin America, turning local struggles into global chess matches. Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, each became arenas where superpowers armed proxies, while local people bore the brunt of the bloodshed. The phrase Third World, originally meaning nations outside the capitalist and communist blocs, soon came to mean places caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, within the superpowers themselves, societies transformed. In the United States, civil rights activists marched demanding an end to segregation and racial injustice. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream echoed across a nation grappling with its conscience. In the Soviet Union, dissent was stifled, but cracks appeared, writers, artists, and reformers quietly pushing against the iron grip. In Europe, the devastation of war gave birth to something remarkable: integration. The European coal and steel community of the 1950s grew into the European Union, a bold experiment in shared sovereignty designed to make future wars unthinkable. Technology galloped ahead. Computers, once room-sized beasts, crunching code for governments, shrank to desktops by the 1980s. Television flickered into every home, broadcasting wars, protests, and moon landings with immediate intimacy. Music, too, became global jazz, rock, reggae, and hip-hop, leaping borders faster than diplomats ever could. Culture was becoming as interconnected as politics. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Cold War seemed eternal. But then suddenly it cracked. The Soviet economy stagnated, weighed down by bureaucracy and military spending. Reformers like Mikhail Gorbachev spoke of glasnost openness and perestroika, restructuring, loosening the iron grip. In 1989, Berliners with hammers and bare hands tore down the Berlin Wall, laughing and crying, as decades of division crumbled into rubble. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, leaving the United States as the lone superpower. The Cold War was over. What followed was a dizzying era of globalization. Markets opened, goods flowed, the internet flickered to life. A teenager in New Delhi could watch the same TV shows as a student in New York. A factory in Shenzhen could produce toys for children in Paris. Nations like China embraced market reforms while maintaining strict political control, rising rapidly into industrial giants. The European Union expanded eastward. The 1990s felt for some like the end of history, liberal democracy, triumphant capitalism unchallenged. But history never ends. The 21st century arrived with its own storms. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks in the United States reminded the world that global interconnection carried dangers as well as benefits. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq followed reshaping geopolitics once again. Meanwhile, technology accelerated beyond imagination. Smartphones placed the sum of human knowledge in billions of pockets. Social media connected, entertained, and enraged, turning everyone into both audience and broadcaster. And the digital revolution did more than change communication. It rewired economies and daily life. Algorithms tracked habits, automation reshaped labor, and virtual spaces began to rival physical ones. For the first time since the plow, humanity was redefining what work even meant. Yet the digital age also exposed new vulnerabilities, misinformation, spreading at the speed of Wi-Fi cyber attacks, crossing borders, invisibly surveillance growing ever more pervasive. At the same time, global challenges grew. Climate change, fueled by 2 centuries of industrial smoke, threatened coastlines, crops, and species. Inequality widened with billionaires riding rockets into orbit, while billions still struggled for clean water and healthcare. Pandemics like COVID-19 in 2020 reminded us that microbes, not missiles, could bring the modern world to its knees. The story of civilization had entered a new chapter, not just states against states, but humanity against the limits of its own planet. And yet, even now, echoes of the past remain. Nations still posture with armies, and alliances recalling the old Cold War habits. Borders still spark conflict, while empires long gone leave shadows in the form of languages, trade routes, and resentments. We are in many ways both heirs and prisoners of history's long arc. Picture the present satellites blinking above, relaying signals to a smartphone in your hand. Cargo ships gliding across oceans, their containers stacked like Lego bricks. Children in Nairobi streaming videos from Seoul. A scientist in Geneva sequencing DNA with machines that run faster than thought. This is our world, wired, crowded, fragile, and extraordinary. From bands around campfires to farmers in villages, from scribes scratching clay tablets to astronauts walking on the moon, the history of civilizations has been a restless experiment. Tonight, as we stand in the digital glow of screens, it is easy to forget how improbable it all is, that we are the descendants of hunters, builders, rebels, dreamers. The story is not over. It never is. The cold peace, the hot, changes the digital dawn. These are simply the latest verses in a song that began when someone long ago lit a fire in the dark and told a story.